Well, I think it's about that time to talk about all of the wrong things, I guess. Just be kind of direct about it. All of the wrong things that these apologists are saying about physics. We've got actually a few different videos here. The first one's rather short, so we're going to start with that one. The second two are longer. I didn't get my coffee before I started the stream. I started the stream and then realized there were just a couple things I had to do. So, but this first video is rather short, and the second two are a little bit longer. This might be a little bit of a longer stream. This might be like a 3.5 hour stream. I don't know how much of the two longer streams that we will end up actually looking at. There will probably be some portions in them. That's not what I click on. There will probably be portions of them that I'm going to fast forward through, maybe even just for the sake of brevity. But yeah, so this one's just a little over 3 minutes, and then the other two, like I said, are the long ones. So let's jump right into this with Dr. Leslie Wickman, who is apparently an astronaut.
Do you think that the Big Bang provides evidence for the existence of God, or would you put it in different words?
I actually do. I think that, the Big Bang model of the universe is much more God-friendly than the theory that was possible or was popular before that, which was the steady state theory.
I'd want to know what she means by that, because what I would say is that God's existence is made equally likely by both theories. Like a steady state model and a Big Bang model both play equally on the notion that God exists or doesn't exist. There's just like, what about a God is going to make one of those more likely or less likely? God could have wanted a steady state universe. God could have wanted a Big Bang universe. So like, I don't understand. No, I'm not saying that like you can't incorporate modern cosmology into your particular theological worldview. I'm just saying I don't understand what about the Big Bang makes it more friendly to God than a steady state model, when I would suppose that the God that she believes in could have created it to be either way.
When the steady state theory basically said that the universe and everything has always existed. So in terms of philosophy or logic, that the universe was self-existent, whereas the growing evidence for the Big Bang being a more accurate model shows that the universe had a beginning. And from the standpoint of logic and philosophy, if anything begins to exist, then it must have a cause for its existence. So if the universe, with the evidence that we're
the thing is, we will hear that a lot, and I just want everybody to be clear about this particular thing. You will hear if something begins to exist, it has to have a cause for its existence a lot, particularly with reference to the Big Bang and God. The first question that you should ask is, what do you mean by begins to exist? And then after you've settled that, ask, okay, what's the argument that things which begin to exist must have causes? Don't just like accept it because there are certain aspects of our intuition and our experience that it happens to align with. Like that's not a good reason. Like if I said, hey, do you suppose that for every object that is around you, that there is a singular value that you could assign to either its position or its momentum at any given time? Most people are going to say yes. But the fact that quantum mechanics confounds that, I think is something that one would need to consider. Just because something seems to fall within your intuitive experience of reality doesn't mean that it must be the case in all instances.
Gathering for the Big Bang model is expanding and continuing to expand, then at some point it must have been smaller, which leads to the kind of the singularity point of the universe, and then a Big Bang expansion event. So if it began to exist rather than having always existed, then it must have a cause for its existence. So something that caused it to come into existence.
So the first thing is that we need to drop the notion that like the Big Bang is where the universe began to exist. Number one, that is vague phraseology that a lot of people in both physics and metaphysics are probably going to raise an eyebrow at. That's the first thing. The other thing that I want to point out, I'm not trying to like attack anybody when I say this, but I think it's just important. This is Dr. Leslie Wickman. Apparently she's an astronaut. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Willamette University, 1980, and Master of Science in Aero and Aerospace Engineering from Stanford University, 1983, and a PhD in Human Factors and Biomechanics, Stanford University, 1994. So I just think that it is important to point out that Dr. Leslie Wickman here, though she's perfectly okay to express her opinions. I'm not saying that she can't say anything that she's saying, or I'm not even necessarily saying that some of what she said is or that any of what she said is wrong. Just that she is not an astronomer. She is not an astrophysicist. She is not a cosmologist. I just want that to be made very clear here.
Which sounds very much like Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth from something that didn't exist before. So, so again, I believe that.
How do you create from something that doesn't exist? What does that even mean?
That simple fact that the Big Bang model points to a beginning of the universe.
Which is something else that needs to be dropped. The idea that the Big Bang points to a beginning of the universe is false. The hot Big Bang model is nothing more than a physical description of the universe and how it evolved through time in its very, very earliest moments during what's known as the period of reheating, which immediately proceeded or came after the inflationary epoch. We do not know if the universe has a beginning, and it very well may not. We do not know that, and the Big Bang does not tell us that it does or that it doesn't.
Makes it much more God-friendly. But beyond that, there's a lot of fine-tuning within the Big Bang event itself that allows for, in the expansion of the universe, given the expansion rate as well as the mass density of the universe, it allows for the possibility of galaxies and stars and solar systems forming. So there's a lot of fine-tuning, even though a lot of times when we talk about the Big Bang, people just tend to think of it as this chaotic explosion. It wasn't chaotic at all. It was finely tuned in terms of being just the exact rate.
The other thing that I think is important is that when you hear atheists talk about fine-tuning, ask them what they mean by that. When you say these constants are finely tuned, can I ask I'm just a little confused. Can I ask what you mean by that? Are you saying that they had to have been set by some intelligence? Or are you saying something different? And this is a very important point with respect to a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about, particularly tonight, physics and the existence of God, as well as in many other areas, is that you need to ask people what they mean by the things that they say. Don't just let them get away with saying things. Try to get at what they mean. And sometimes it's even prudent to ask people what they mean, even if you know what they mean, or at least can reasonably presume what they mean, just to see if they actually have a strong understanding of the things that they're talking about. Because that can help you gauge the level of understanding that your interlocutor has with respect to whatever topic it is that you guys might be discussing, and that might allow you as an interlocutor in that discussion to better engage with them.
The exact mass density that's needed to actually be able to form galaxies, stars, solar systems, and planets that could harbor.
A lot of that we're still not really fully sure about how a lot of that formed. That's the thing. We don't fully know exactly how galaxies formed. We got some ideas. The James Webb Space Telescope has corrected some of those ideas and given us a lot more robust data to work from, but we still have a lot that we need to learn about this stuff. And there's a lot that I could say about specifically fine-tuning, but I'm not here for the sake of brevity, just because we do have a few different videos to go over, and I don't want this stream to be 5 or 6 hours, though. I mean, if it is, oh well, I doubt it'll be that long. But there are other videos where I talk about specifically fine-tuning or other teleological arguments, so if you are more interested in that, you can browse my channel and you'll find those videos.
For life.
Hello, Cameron here. Thanks.
All right, so that's that video. This next video, and like I said, that one was a shorter one. I just want to remind everybody. Just thought I should touch on those no pun intended, timeless claims that are made about the Big Bang and God's existence. This next video is a little bit longer. This one is from Joe Schmid.
Right. Hey,
okay, why does it keep doing that? Just because I click full screen doesn't mean I want to click play. That's not how this should be working. This was on Joe Schmid's channel, who is down here at the bottom. He's actually, I believe, I don't know why I'm saying this when I have my own live stream, but it doesn't really matter. He is actually live on, I believe, Myth Vision podcast right now, talking about God's existence and sort of I believe, like the philosophy and the science and stuff associated with that. Really fucking brilliant guy. I mean, like, Joe Schmid is insanely fucking intelligent. Like, this is a guy that if tells you you're wrong on something, your first reaction should be to start questioning the truth of whatever it is you just said that he told you that you're wrong on. He also has a channel, Majesty of Reason. You should go subscribe to it. But he had William Lane Craig, who I don't think I need to point out here. This is obviously the old white guy. And Dr. Ryan Mullins. I should say Dr. William Lane Craig if I didn't, because he has 2 PhDs. He is a legitimate scholar. Whether you like him or not, he is a very legitimate scholar. And Dr. Ryan Mullins, who I believe is also a theist. And they're talking about God, time, and creation. And we're going to watch this. So like I said, there might be some parts where I skip through if I just think that some of the material is just not that interesting. Because again, there is another roughly hour, actually about an hour and 15-minute video after this that I'd like to review as well. So you might see me cut through some of this and the next video just for the sake of brevity. But all 3 of the videos that I have been reviewing, that I will be reviewing in this, are linked down in the description. So let's get going with this one.
All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today we're chatting with Dr. William Lane Craig and Dr. Ryan Mullins on God, time, creation, and everything in between. While I myself have much to say on these topics, my goal today is going to be to play a moderating role. And I'm going to be short with the introduction because most of my audience will know both of you guys, both of my guests. But Dr. William Lane Craig is a philosopher and theologian who has published widely in philosophy of religion, philosophy of time, metaphysics, and more. Likewise, Dr. Ryan Mullins is a theologian and philosopher who publishes primarily in analytic theology and philosophy of time. So thank you guys both for coming on. I'm very excited for this. time, firstly. Dr. Craig affirms a relational theory of time, whereas Dr. Mullins affirms the absolute theory of time. And we're going to need some clarity on these terms before looking at arguments for and against each view. So, Dr. Craig, can you tell us a little bit about the relational theory of time?
Certainly. I think that the contrast to be drawn here, Joe, is between a relational theory of time and a substantival view of time. The word absolute in these debates is used so many different ways that the term is ambiguous or multivalent. And so I don't think it's helpful to draw this distinction as relational versus absolute. Rather, the distinction is between a view that thinks of time as a substance, something that actually exists, as opposed to a relational view that sees time as a relation of before and after between events. And I myself actually am very open to either view, but I tend not to believe that time is a substance, a thing, and that therefore it's plausibly a relation of before and after that arises from the occurrence of events.
I just want to make sure I'm getting it just right. So it's not a thing in your ontology. Time is not a thing in your ontology. It's just a relationship between events of before and after.
Yeah.
Okay. Craig's right. Like when you look at all the literature, absolutes used in a million different ways.
Yeah.
So substantivalism usually is a better way to go because that is actually.
So it was kind of said there, but I do want to just clarify. I say substantivalism instead of substantivalism, just because I think I pronounce words in a way that when people hear substantival, the way that it's pronounced might not get them to think of substance as the root word. But if you say substantival, that you hear that root word substance in there a little bit more. That's why I speak the way that I do sometimes. And anyway, so a relationalist view with respect to time would be a view that time is not, and this can apply to not just time but to space-time as well. That it is not itself a substance or itself a thing that exists. That time or space-time exists only in virtue of there being objects of whether material or physical objects or perhaps some sort of supernatural or other form of metaphysical object or something like that exists, and there are relations, either spatial or temporal relations held between them, but that those relations do not consist in some further ontologically real substance of some sort. They only exist in virtue of the relations that are held by whatever entities exist. So that space, or rather time or space-time, is the relations. There isn't something underneath the relations. It's just the relations. Hence the name relationalism or relationism. And then substantivalism is the idea that time or space-time is itself a substance. It is a thing that would continue to exist even if there were no objects to stand in relations. And so that's where you get the word substantivalism from. It's a substance. Time or space-time is a substance that which can exist independently of entities which stand in temporal or spatiotemporal relations. So that's the difference between relationism and substantivalism in the philosophy of time.
The claim when you look at Eastern and Western philosophers throughout history, they're going to say that time is an actual substance. And so typically what they'll say and
I suppose I should clarify, because a lot of people have asked me, am I a relationist or a substantivalist? That is confusing. I think I would say neither, because I think that classically speaking, space-time is a physical thing. It's as physical as temperature would be, but that much like temperature, well, we know that temperature emerges from more fundamental underlying physical states. Temperature is nothing more than the mean molecular energy of some atomic material or molecular and thereby atomic material. But we're not sure that space-time is emergent, though I do think that a lot of physicists are probably turning in that direction, particularly those working in foundations of physics. And so I would say that I think classically space-time is a physical thing, but that it is still something that is likely emergent and not fundamental. And so I don't think that myself, along with a lot of physicists, would really fall solidly into a substantivalist or a relationist camp.
In Eastern and Western philosophy is that time is an eternal and uncaused substance, and it plays several different roles. And then there's precedents within Christianity and Hinduism, maybe Islam. I've been trying to talk to some different scholars on this. There's precedent to say that time should be identified with God. So you see this in Henry Moore, you see this in Isaac Newton and Samuel Clarke, and then you see this in Raghunatha Shiromani in the Hindu tradition. And then what the absolute theory does is they'll make a distinction between time and moments of time. So a moment of time is the way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. And so here's the big idea. So time plays three big roles. First, time is the thing that makes change possible. And then second, time is the source of moments. And then third, time is the thing that unifies a series of moments into a coherent timeline. And so on this sort of kind of like Newtonian or Morean view that I'm wanting to defend, I want to say that God should be identified with time. And this is because God is an eternal, uncaused substance that makes change possible. So given God's power and
now, obviously, because of the nature of the discussion, and I'm not saying this to like take digs at either Dr. Mullins or Dr. Craig, both of whom I do actually think are quite brilliant, even if I disagree with them on some things. This should not be taken as a dig against them, but because of the nature of this discussion, it's not so much a debate. There are going to be things that they say that they don't really defend, and so I'm not going to sit there and try to like talk about it. But like a lot of, with respect to what Ryan is saying here, I mean, I do disagree. I would ask for a lot of arguments for these things, but again, that's just the nature of the discussion. So,
freedom, change is possible. And then further, God is the source of moments, because God all alone prior to creation, that's a particular way that things are. And given his eternal power and freedom, that's the way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. So, because God could subsequently be otherwise if he chooses to exercise his power and his freedom to like do something different, to create something. And then further, I want to say that God's the thing that unifies a series of moments into a coherent timeline. So whatever theory of providence you want to affirm, you want to be a theological determinist, you want to be a Molinist, you want to be an open theist, it doesn't matter. Whatever theory of providence you tell, that's the story of how God goes about organizing or arranging the different moments into a successive series.
I think I should point out the Kalam cosmological argument is a logically coherent argument. It is a deductively valid argument. There isn't a single philosopher who's going to deny that the Kalam cosmological argument is a deductively valid argument, at least no competent one. The question is whether it's a sound argument, and I don't think it's a sound argument. I think most philosophers are going to say it is not a sound argument, but I don't know any that would deny that it is logically coherent. It is a deductively valid argument. The conclusion follows from the premises. The question is whether or not the premises are actually true.
Series or a timeline. That's the big idea.
Also, my StreamYard is telling me that my connection is a little weak, so I'm going to just turn my camera off for the time being just to see if that helps at all. I don't know if it's lagging, but I don't want it to start lagging and cutting in and out, so my camera might be off for a time. Just want to let you guys know.
Yeah, so Dr. Craig, if you want to ask him like clarifying questions before we go on to like reasons to believe these, you can, and now if you want to do that.
It sounds to me like pantheism.
I think I would agree with this. While I think that both the Kalam cosmological argument and other contingency-style cosmological arguments are the best arguments out, I really do. I think that they're the ones that are going to most immediately appeal to people. They're the ones that are going to be the most immediately, at least in a prima facie sense, they're going to be the ones that are the hardest to object to. But I don't think. So I think, I don't know if this is going to make any sense to anybody, but I think they're good arguments, but I don't think that they're good arguments. I think that people might know what I mean because of the way that I emphasize the word good in both of those instances, but I don't know how else to say it. I think they're good arguments, but I don't think they're good arguments. Like, I think they're convincing. They're good in the sense that they can convince, but they're not good in the sense that they really don't hold up nearly as well as people like Dr. Craig would have us believe under a stricter metaphysical analysis.
To identify time with God sounds pantheistic, so I wouldn't be surprised to see this in Hinduism. But Ryan, I think it's certainly not Isaac Newton's view. Newton was explicit that time is an emanative effect of God's being. And so I'd like to know, why not affirm with Newton that God is the emanative cause of time? That would allow you to identify to make.
Newton, and then to the charge of pantheism. So pantheism says,
I'm just skipping
that
through some of
occur
this
at
just because, again, some of this I'm not really I'm just really not interested
That
in
was
yes,
what
time is, but
responding to.
moments of time are not identical to time, because this view distinguishes these two things.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think the thing here is that Dr. Craig is probably going to think that time
Those are
is, or that the
part-
moments of time are constitutive of time. What is time if not the concatenation of its moments? Now, I mean, I'm not an expert on Dr. Craig, but I certainly followed him closely when I was a Christian and did it, study and read in apologetics and even after. But I feel here, let's see what he has to say.
parts or intervals into which time can be divided.
I want to deny this because I want to say moments of time are contingent features of reality. Most of them are, other than maybe the first moment or something. Because again, there's time, and then there's this other stuff called these moments, and time is the source of these moments.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't understand why I should think they're in a part-whole relationship. Mainly because I don't.
I just want to ask you guys that are in the side chat, if it's getting laggy or if it's getting choppy at all, please let me know. My laptop is telling me I've got a strong signal. StreamYard is telling me that my connection is kind of wavering between weak and fairly good. So just if it gets choppy, if it gets laggy, please let me know in the side chat, and I'm going to turn my camera back off. But my laptop's reading strong signal, so I'm going to go with what my laptop's telling me and keep my camera on for now, because I like to have that on when I'm doing live streams.
When I look at part-whole relationships outside of material objects, I lose my grasp of what we're talking about very fast in any
Wait, hold on. What did he say there?
relationship. Mainly because I don't. When I look at part-whole relationships outside of material objects, I lose my grasp of what we're talking about very fast.
I would agree with Ryan, with Dr. Mullins there, with Ryan strongly, that when we're talking about part-whole relations and we're not talking about like material objects or some sort of like physical substance, I'm lost as to what it is that we're talking about. It just doesn't seem to make sense to talk about parts and wholes if we're not talking about some sort of material or physical substance or another. Like what like what are you talking about? Like, I don't understand.
Fast in any literal sense. And since we're talking about an immaterial God and moments, which a lot of times people take moments to be abstracta, should I take those to be literal parts? I don't know. It sounds weird.
Well, I think we can think of moments as interval.
Another just interesting point that I think this discussion, because I did watch a lot of it, I kind of skimmed through it when it came out. Well, I was watching it live. I was kind of in and out, but then we're not live. I think it was a premiere. Was it live or was it a premiere? I can't remember. I think it was a premiere because I think there is a little bit of editing in it. I'm pretty sure he premiered it rather than it was live. But I do want to say, though, what you'll notice in this discussion between Craig and Mullins, and it's not really a debate. I don't think they're disagreeing all that much. But what you'll notice is sort of the old style apologetics of Dr. William Lane Craig versus more of a newer style of Dr. Ryan Mullins, where Mullins is more, I think, open to incorporating certain, what might be considered idiosyncratic or heterodox ideals into his Christian viewpoint that Dr. Craig is not going to want to consider. And I think that distinction really emphasizes the difference between the sort of old school apologetics of people like Dr. Craig in this, I don't know if you would call it new school, but like Dr. Ryan Mullins, Josh Rasmussen, inspiring philosophy. You know, a lot of these guys, these are people who aren't turning to the same old arguments. They're coming up with different things, new things. They're willing to make certain concessions that the old school apologists aren't. And so there is sort of a distinction that you can see between, you know, how apologists today handle these issues versus how apologists of the 60s, 70s, and 80s did in this discussion.
Of time, and they could be various durations of time. And so it would seem to me that moments would be intervals into which time can be divided, which would be one more reason I wouldn't want to identify God with time. But you...
With respect to my view, I guess, since I am sort of critiquing the video here, I suppose I should, you know, actually do that instead of, you know, giving the two props the whole time. But, you know, credit where credit's due. But I view moments of time as sort of, I would say that moments of time are abstract in the sense that they're convented by humans. There is no objective way to sort of partition time into moments of some sort. That's done by humans using a variety of conventions, such as, you know, Earth's orbit around the sun, Earth's orbit around its axis. There's a variety of things that we utilize for sort of partitioning time into moments. So moments of time to me are sort of an abstract convention of humans and probably other agents that experience time, that are intelligent enough to experience time similar to us. However, that being said, I don't think that time itself is like an abstract convention. Time is a real physical thing, but how we partition time into moments, minutes, seconds, hours, days, those are all abstract conventions of humans. So there are no objective moments of time. There's just time, and then we come up with a variety of conventions for partitioning it. But if we didn't exist, there would be no moments of time. Just like there would be no, like, places in space. That's sort of a way that we talk about space because of how we experience it.
You are thinking of moments as something that's different from intervals of time, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I guess the way I would see intervals would be a set of moments, because I think temporal relationships are between moments. Is typically how I'm going to see it. So this is like the way like Ulrich Mayer and Kit Fine start to kind of define things. So it's a very different way of looking at it than some of the like kind of the 20th century analytic philosophy has looked at things. But yeah, should we get onto the Newton claim though?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Emily Thomas's book Absolute Time riffs in modern British philosophy. So she tries to give a different interpretation of Newton. So she looks through all these letters of Newton, a lot of correspondence.
By the way, it hasn't really been defined. I would suspect that Ryan is probably here going to give some sort of outline of it. But absolute time is this idea, Newton did hold to it, that there is sort of a clock that is ticking, and that clock reads off an absolute time felt by everyone everywhere in the universe. So at any instant of time, everyone in the universe will agree on the same sort of moments of time, that the clock that is ticking time off, all observers, that all observers can, in fact, agree on what that clock is. Now, what Craig is going to say is that he doesn't hold to that view. He thinks that observers can get differences in the time that they read as a result of, potentially relativistic effects, but that there is still an objective, universal, present moment, even if we don't measure that it's still, but Craig thinks it's cosmic time and that's God's time. But that's different than like what absolute time in like the Newtonian sense would have been, which is that there's one clock, and that clock assigns a time universally to all moments in exactly the same way, that all moments in the universe will agree on what time it is. So it's essentially foregoing time dilation and the relativity of time. That's generally what at least how Newton would have looked at it. That's what time is. Now, there are some people that can hold, I don't know if it would be an absolute time, but can hold to this notion that there is like a universal time, but that other agents can still measure differences in time as a result of a variety of effects, but yet there is still a sort of universal time. And again, that would be, I believe, something along the lines of what Dr. Craig holds to. And that universal time is cosmic time, and that time is God's time. And that's the real objective time that we can look at to figure out what the real present moment is.
That he had with different people, and she says, when you're looking at these claims about emanative effects, emanation and emanative causes, she's like, there's a particular way that a lot of the moderns are using that term. And so her claim, this is her claim, and I'm just following hers, is that the way that should be interpreted is attributes are emanative effects of substances. And she gives
on the table, we can now go to some reasons to think that each respective view is correct. So we're going to begin with Dr. Craig, and I guess we can ask, maybe what are some of the motivations, or like, what's your main motivation, Dr. Craig, for thinking that the relational view of time is true?
Well, I don't have any knockdown argument for which way to think of time. In my work on God and time, this was one of the questions that I didn't have time to explore adequately, because I was so preoccupied with what I think is the far more important question of whether time is tensed or tenseless. It seems to me that that's the real watershed issue, and that ultimately it makes no difference to God's relationship to time, whether we think of time as a substance or as a relation. I just have real trouble thinking of times being a substance, especially if...
Well, so I don't want to make any like definitive statements here, but I do think that the relationism versus substantivalism discussion or debate can bear on the tenseless debate. So like, take for instance the relational, if it's somebody who holds to a relationism, it seems to me that it's going to be, not that it can't be done, but if time is nothing more, if time consists in the relations held between entities, whether physical or supernatural, I'm not making that distinction, just entities, then it seems, I'm not going to say that it's expected, but it seems easier to accept at least the notion that there could be differences in times that are measured between different frames of reference, so to speak, as a result of different relations being stood in. And so it seems that, like, I'm not going to say that a relationist view mandates a tenseless view. I don't think that's true, but I think it plays a little bit more nicely with one. This just raises interesting questions, because Dr. Craig is a presentist. How exactly does a presentist view of time meld with a relational view of time? Are there certain relations that are held but that like don't exist, like and then if they don't exist, and in virtue of what are those relations held? What about past temporal relations, future temporal relations? There's a lot of interesting questions, and so I think that I guess what I'm saying is it seems maybe a little bit, not that Dr. Craig is doing it on purpose or anything like that, but I think it could come off as maybe a little bit dismissive to sort of say, well, I don't think that relationism versus substantivalism is as important as tense versus tenseless, because I think that the relationism substantivalism debate might actually have some things to say about whether time is tense or tenseless. Now, I'm not going to get into all the questions that could be asked or the rabbit trails that could be gone down with respect to that. I'll leave that to you guys to hopefully be interested enough to go read into and think about. But certainly that I think that there's a much closer relation between the relationism versus substantivalism debate and the tense versus tenseless debate. Excuse me.
Time is tensed. Substances endure through time, but time doesn't endure through time. So it seems to me that it's just a category mistake to think of time as a substance. Now, Ryan would make time a substance by identifying time with God. And as I've already expressed my misgivings about this, I think this is quite wrong. Time is one-dimensional and has the geometrical properties of a line. God does not. Time can be divided into moments which elapse one after another. God cannot. The parts of time are related as earlier than and later than. God is not. Moreover, God is personal. Time is not. God has compassion on us. Time does not. God forgives our sins. Time does not. God is the Father of the Lord Jesus Christ. Time is not. So it seems to me just wrong to think of God and time as identical.
Well, so not that necessarily Dr. Craig would make this argument, but just to sort of par that with others that might, like, say, identify God with goodness, you could make the same argument that Craig just made to argue that God is not identical to goodness. That, you know, God is personal, goodness is not. God forgives our sins, goodness does not. God is the Lord Jesus Christ, goodness is not. You know, all that stuff. So where a lot of theists might try to argue that God is identical with other properties, I think that the same argument that Craig is making for why God should not be considered identical to time, there's a lot of other properties that some theists might argue God is identical to, that you could run the same exact arguments against, and I think rather successfully. I just wanted to note that.
So I don't have a knockdown argument to offer for a substantival view of time. It just seems to me time isn't a substance. And it seems to me further than in the utter absence of anything happening, that would be a state of timelessness. Nothing's going on. There wouldn't be any before and after in the utter absence of any events. And so those are the reasons for my inclination toward a non-substantival view of time.
Yeah, Ryan, so before getting on to some of your reasons for, believing in a substantival view, I think it'd be interesting to have you guys interact a little bit on some of the reasons that Dr. Craig just gave.
Yeah, so when different people are saying that we are identifying time with God, the claim is it's like a mode or an attribute of God. And if that's the case, then a lot of the objections just laid out wouldn't really make a big deal. So omnipotence doesn't forgive you. Omnipotence doesn't have compassion on you. God does. Well, okay, who cares? No problem. Same thing about time. You're like, well, time doesn't have compassion on you. Time doesn't create you. We're like, well, right, God does. Time is an attribute of God. So not really seeing the force of this once we get clear on what the claim is. The other thing is a lot of the statements made here.
Exactly. See, I think that's a good response. Time can be a property or a mode of God, but that doesn't mean that it has to do all these things, because we wouldn't say that about God's goodness or his omnipotence or, his moral perfection or his sovereignty. God forgives us. His sovereignty does not. God loves us. His sovereignty does not. So yeah, I think Ryan is making a reasonably salient point here.
About time being tensed. I think these are statements about the timeline, about the moments of time. So time, I don't think, is tensed, but moments are tensed, or reality as a whole would be tensed.
But the thing is that if time is nothing more than its moments, then that's just to say that time is tensed. I think that's how Craig would respond right there.
And so, yeah, so I think what's going on here in a lot of these sort of...
Because again, Craig holds a relational view. So to him, that time is its moments. Time consists in its moments. And if time is tensed, that's just to say that its moments are tensed. Only the moments currently in the present, only the moments that can be described as present are moments of time that exist. Future and past moments do not exist.
Sort of cases, a lot of these debates is when people are looking at certain questions, they're thinking about the moments themselves or the timeline itself and not time itself. So this is a point that Marcello Fioco raises a lot in his work, where he says, look, unless philosophers of time tell you what time is, all they're doing is having these debates about tense versus tenseless, A theory, B theory, endurance, perdurance, you name it. Unless you know what time itself is, how do we know we're even having a debate about reality itself or about time itself? And so for him, he's saying when we get clear on what time is, and he lays out the view that I just laid out, other than the God stuff, he doesn't seem to care about God. He'll say all those debates are about the timeline. They're not about time itself. That's the strategy, at least.
It seems to me, therefore, Ryan, that you are not, in fact, saying that time is identical with God or to be identified with God. You're saying time is a mode or property of God, in which case it's not a substance, because properties and modes aren't substances. So this is a non-substantival view of time of some sort. And I would wonder, what would be the difference between saying time is a property or mode of God and simply saying that God is temporal? Because I agree with the latter statement. I think that God is in time. He experiences time and the succession of moments, but I wouldn't identify it with his property. So what would be the difference between identifying time with a property of God and simply affirming that God is temporal, which we both want to do?
Yeah, so there's different motivations here. So Samuel Clarke, when he's looking at this sort of stuff, that's what his statement is, temporal. But he also thinks that time itself is eternal, because he thinks like there has context. The motivation there is to go, we've got this particular ontology where we've got space, time, the ether, sound, because apparently sound's a substance in our ontology. Don't know why. And he says, this is a ridiculously bloated ontology. I don't need all these different substances floating around. I just need one, and that's God. I just need one substance that can do it all. And so it's sort of a way of kind of like taking like an Occam's razor approach and saying, I can have one substance that just does all.
The Newtonian Clarkean view, that God is temporal, has the property of being temporal, but I don't think we need to go beyond that to say that the time is a mode of God himself. And so let's leave this Hindu pantheist to the side and ask, why should we disagree with Newton or Clarke as I interpret them, and just think of God as an eternal being who endures omnitemporally?
Well, first, I disagree. It's not pantheism, because you'd say some things exist in time and they're not identical to time. So you and I exist in time and we're not identical to time.
No, but this fellow you quoted, the pantheist,
yeah, and that's what the Shiromati would say too.
You only need one substance, right? And that does it all. There's really only one thing that exists.
For a certain set of categories. For contingent beings like the success, it's not God. Yeah. The different circularity.
Maybe some anti-motivations from you. So let's hear those.
All right. So I've got two problems I want to highlight for the relational theory. So the first is it's difficult to figure out what the relational theory really is. And then the second is the relational theory runs into different circularity problems. So let's start with the first one. So W.H. Newton Smith, he comments that the relational theory of time, it's been so attractive to physicists and philosophers that they've not really bothered to articulate it and defend it. They just think like, it's just got to be true. Like, it just has to be. But the lack of articulation, it leads to a theory that it's so nebulous that one wonders what it could possibly be. So John Ehrman, he says, there are almost as many versions of relationalism as there are relationalists. And as far as I can tell, that's not a good thing for the relational theory of time. A theory that can be barely articulated, that's no theory at all. So that's a general idea with, like for the first problem. Here's the second problem, though. So I think that a lot of approaches to the relational theory entail some kind of circularity. So the general idea within the relational theory of time is refusal to take time to be an entity or within our ontology. So the relationalist wants to reduce time away to something more basic, some non-temporal entity that we already accept in our ontology. And how this reduction is achieved, like that's like up for grabs. But the goal is to offer a more like ontologically parsimonious picture of the world. But I believe that the different attempts to do this, they're going to fall victim to different kind of circularity problems. So here's an example. So it's common to say that time is merely the measure of change. That sounds fine until you ask the question, what is change? Because most philosophers define change in terms of time. So let me give you an example.
Well, it's actually a pretty good point. Like a lot of people say, well, time is just like, change. And it's like, well, what's change? Physics doesn't understand time as being change. It understands change as occurring in space-time. So, I mean, that's how a physicist is going to look at it.
An example of this. So D.H. Mellor, so Hugh Mellor, he says, change here I take to be temporal variation in the properties of things. By this I mean that changes are things having at different times incompatible properties. Properties that no one thing could have at the same time. So notice the circularity here. So change is defined in terms
of creation and things like that. So both of you affirm that God is temporal, at least with creation.
I'm just skipping ahead to what I think are probably going to be more interesting parts to talk about. And I have something in my eye at the same time, apparently.
But you disagree about God's state causally prior to creation. So let's start by defining divine timelessness and divine temporality. So Dr. Craig, can you take us through divine timelessness and divine temporality? Like, what do these mean?
Sure. To say that God is temporal is to say that God has both temporal location and temporal duration. And to say that he's timeless is to say that he is not temporal. So these are contradictories. Being temporal involves having a temporal location and a temporal duration, and being timeless is to be non-temporal.
Yeah, Ryan, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, just to make clear to the audience. So when you're looking historically at philosophy East and West, everyone agrees that if God exists, God is eternal, meaning God exists without beginning and without end. But there's different ways to interpret what else you want to add on to that. And so the timelessness claim is going to be adding on these statements about no succession, no temporal beginning without end. But Bill and I are not doing that. We're not doing that. We're going to say God does not begin to exist because God necessarily exists. But at some point in the life of God, God's going to have temporal location. He's going to undergo succession. He's going to endure. These are the kind of claims from temporality.
Yeah, so as I like to think about it, I like to visualize it in terms of succession, right? So under divine temporality, like God's going to undergo succession in some manner. Like he might think one thing and then another, or he might know that it's 12 p.m. and then it's 12:01. Whereas under divine timelessness, there's no succession in God's life. So anything that God experiences, anything in God's life is just kind of had in this one timeless moment. It's just all there, and there's no succession. There's no one thing after another. It's just yeah, it's just all there.
Yeah.
Kind of as I think of almost a frozen life. But anyway, okay. Another piece of the puzzle here. Yeah.
If I might interject something here, Joe, I think you are right. But in talking about temporal succession, that is presupposing the truth of a tense theory of time, which in my view is the real watershed issue. On a tenseless theory of time, there really is no succession of moments one after another. They're all equally real and existent, just like the intervals on a spatial line. The first inch of a yardstick is not any earlier than the second inch, and the second inch is not a successor of the first. And so in talking about temporal succession, I think we're presupposing a tense view of time, which I think is correct. but it's good to be self-conscious that is what we're doing.
That's good. That's a great clarification.
So I think there's just a little bit of inaccuracy there, because it seemed that what Dr. Craig was referring to is sort of spatialization of time, that time is just like space. I think that time is similar to space. I think there are analogies we can draw between space and time to more accurately depict how time actually exists ontologically in the world. But I don't think that time is spatialized. I do think space-time is four-dimensional, but I don't think that we should spatialize time. And so this analogy to the ruler, I don't think works. I also think that a problem with how Dr. Craig is framing this seems to be that it paints time as that there actually isn't any change or any dynamicity occurring, that there's just this set of static moments that are concatenated and they're all real. But that's not the case under a tenseless view. Maybe under certain versions of it, but not broadly, certainly. Because moments of time are not a real thing. There is no objective way to partition time. And so time is just sort of a dimension through which things in the universe are extended and in which events happen, much like space. And this is where you can draw analogies between space and time, but you shouldn't understand them as the same thing.
Actually, I want to reject that, because so Natalia Ding, who is a contemporary proponent of the B theory of time, the tenseless theory of time, one of the points she hammers over and over is that there is an actual account of succession. There's no account of temporal becoming, but she thinks temporal becoming and succession come apart. So the ordering of the moments on the B theory is successive. It is earlier and later than relations. And she says those are successive ordering relations. And you see this in a lot of other B theorists as well. So you see this in Ted Sider and whatnot. Now, what you can say is you can go, I see they want to make that claim. It's just not coherent and reject it. But I want to say at least they really are going to the mat and saying like, no, we've got all the succession you'd ever want.
Yeah, I think both of those are good clarifications. So we've got divine timelessness and divine temporality down, and now we can go on to the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. So Ryan, how do you understand this doctrine? Eventually, we're getting to the juicy stuff, audience, but we have to lay the foundations first. So yeah, Ryan.
Right. So typically people say that the doctrine means that God did not create the universe out of any pre-existent material. And that's fine, but that's not the full story when you look at Western history. So what I'm doing is I'm following a very standard...
I mean, yes, but it technically, creatio ex nihilo would be a little deeper than that. It is that God created out of nothing, that there is not anything from which God created whatever it is that he created ex nihilo. So it's not just that there is an absence of material. God did not create out of anything at all. And as we open up this idea a little bit more, I'm going to explain why that's somewhat incoherent. I don't mean logically incoherent either.
Set of medieval definitions that actually you can trace back to some kind of earlier pre-Christian era. So there's this really ancient debate that carried on into the Middle Ages between what's called a doctrine of eternal creation and a doctrine of creation out of nothing. So according to Samuel Liebens, he says creation ex nihilo can be understood as the affirmation, and this is a quote from Sam, the universe was created by God at some point in time, perhaps the first moment in time, before which there was nothing except God. And so Sam says this doctrine is going to be distinct from eternal creation, which is the universe has always existed with no beginning. It is nevertheless God's creation. He is eternally creating it, giving it being. And so I want to elaborate on a particular point, because sometimes people accuse me of making stuff up, and sometimes people make this sort of accusation against Craig's view as well. There's this point that I think has been lost in a lot of contemporary philosophical theology, and it's this idea of God existing all alone. So in the ancient and medieval world, it's assumed that if something begins to exist, it is preceded by non-existence. You see this take a huge role in a lot of Christian and a lot of Islamic debates about the temporality or the timelessness of God. And so here's what it means for the doctrine of creation out of nothing. So the doctrine of creation ex nihilo says that the universe began to exist, so it cannot be co-eternal with a God who lacks a beginning. And this in turn entails that there's some sort of state of affairs where God exists all alone without creation. And you see this explicitly affirmed by Christians, Jews, and Muslims. So let me just give you 3 quick examples. So Boethius. Boethius says, now this our religion, which is called Christian and Catholic, is founded chiefly on the following assertions. From all eternity, that is, before the world was established, and so before all that is meant by time began, there has existed one divine substance of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And then he goes on to say, we affirm one God, not 3 gods.
I'm going to let Ryan keep explaining this really quickly. I'm going to run. I got to go grab another beverage quickly, but I'm going to let the video play.
But then he goes on to say that he did not produce it from his own substance, that he determined to form the world and brought it into being when it was absolutely not. So you see that idea of something begins to exist when it's preceded by non-existence. Let me give you a Jewish example. So I just give you a Christian example. Let me give you a Jewish example. So Moses Maimonides, he says, in the beginning, God alone existed and nothing else. So you've got God alone, God and no cosmic stuff. Now let me give you an Islamic thinker, Al-Ghazali. He says, God brought the universe into being after its non-existence and made it something after it had been nothing, since from eternity he alone was existent and there was nothing along with him. I could belabor the point with lots of other historical sources, but here's the big idea. Creation out of nothing, it does involve the claim that God exists all alone. And that's what reinforces the claim that God's not making the universe out of any pre-existent material. There really is God all alone, and he's free to create or not create. And I want to say this is important because, again, some of the arguments I've run, some of the arguments that Craig has run against timelessness, people just ignore this entirely and say, oh, God and the universe are always co-eternal. God never exists without the universe. And I'm going to go, I'm sorry, that's not basic church history. Like, we have to be, like, I'm just saying you're going to affirm certain Christian doctrines, you have to affirm the actual Christian doctrine. That's the idea.
Yes, I love it that Ryan has emphasized the inherently temporal nature of creatio ex nihilo. And this understanding of the doctrine is in sharp contrast with Thomas Aquinas' view, according to which creation does not imply a temporal beginning of existence. Rather, for Aquinas, it simply means that God is the sole source of being of created things. He didn't create them out of anything. He is their sole ground of being. And that's consistent with eternal creation. But biblically speaking, the idea of creation is inherently bound up with a temporal beginning of the world, and hence a state of affairs in which God alone exists without the world, without creation. And so I think that the view that Ryan is expressing is the more faithful biblical concept of creation. I would only want to qualify Ryan's statement, quote, if something begins to exist, it is preceded by a state of non-existence. That's not, in fact, what Samuel Labens said. What Labens said was, the universe was created by God at some point in time before which there was nothing. And so Laban's view doesn't imply that if time began to exist, or if the universe began to exist, there was a time prior to the beginning of the universe, a time of non-existence. What he says is that it means there is a point in time before which nothing existed.
Apparently I'm muted. I think I would agree with that assessment. It's not saying that there is a time before time in which non-existence endured as some state, but that there are no states through which something endures prior, quote unquote, prior to the creation of time. That sans time, there is no states through which something is enduring. Not that there are and that something is non-existence, just that there are no states and nothing enduring.
Yeah, so that's not Sam's view about what the definition of what it means to begin to exist. It's the historical Western view of what it means to begin to exist. So you can see this traced back to debates over how to interpret Plato that influence a lot of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic debates over should we say that God creates out of nothing, or should we say that that the universe is co-eternal with God? And you see that really explicitly in the Al-Ghazali quote that I have, where he says, God brought the universe, into being after its non-existence. And then you see this also in Ibn Taymiyyah, who wants to reject creation out of nothing. He thinks it's awful. He thinks it's the worst doctrine ever, want to have a doctrine of eternal creation. But he still affirms that anything that God does create, it begins to exist. Any given item that God creates, it begins to exist after a state of non-existence. So this is like a deep, deep understanding of how, or the definition of what it means to begin to exist that you see throughout the Western debates over these sort of things. That's the claim I'm making.
I think that's just a façon de parler, Ryan, when they say the world began to exist after something like that, because people like Ghazali and Boethius conceive of God as timeless in its being, in his being. And therefore, it's just an almost inevitable façon de parler to say that if the universe...
I've heard the phrase façon de parler before. I know it has, like, I don't know what the exact translation is. I don't know if it means like turn a phrase or something like that, but I think it's something along those lines.
Began to exist, then it came into being after God had existed alone. But I don't think that should be pressed for technical precision.
Oh yeah, I want to press it all day long because I can't understand the problems that...
I do have to say, I'm really liking how Ryan is like just willing to be like, yeah, no, I am just going to openly disagree with you here. And I think I have good reasons for doing so. I really do like it. Not like that, like, somebody's disagreeing with Dr. Craig, but just that I really like how we're actually getting, like I said earlier, we're getting that distinction between sort of how these old school apologists look at this and how some of these newer ones are starting to consider these. And I think that what we're finding is that a lot of these newer apologists, like Ryan, and theologians, I shouldn't say just apologists alone, but these theologians are willing to make certain concessions that the older ones aren't. They're willing to consider different frameworks and, some more modern work that some of the older ones aren't. And I think that that's really being played out here.
They are facing without that. So when I look at Augustine and then all sorts of debates that follow from there, like the worries he has are about this exact claim. That if you Christians, you silly Christians, you're denying the science of the day that says the universe is eternal. If you're going to say the universe began, you have this problem of God alone, then God with cosmic stuff. So that's one of the main arguments against the doctrine of creation out of nothing you see historically.
Oh, but Augustine is the sort of prime candidate for the person who says that it's foolish to ask what God was doing prior to creation, because time comes into being with creation. He says God created the universe with time, not in time. So I think you can find this other current of thought that I'm describing as well, and that Laban's correctly characterized, rather than pressing this façon de parler for philosophical precision.
Okay. Well, we should, for the sake of time.
Because we're just about to move off of, I can turn my camera back on fucking damn bars on StreamYard. Okay. The thing with creatio ex nihilo, and I say it that way because that's how somebody 900 years ago who spoke Latin would say it, creatio ex nihilo. The issue that I have with that is more of a conceptual issue, because it seems to be saying that God creates out of nothing. And what that seems to be saying is that there is not anything out of which God created. It's not. It's almost like it's saying that God did not create out of anything, and then that seems to just be saying that God didn't create. There is nothing from which God created. There is nothing that God acted on. God did not act on anything. God did not create from anything, and that seems to just ultimately be saying that God did not create, that God was not in an action of creation. And so the whole notion of creatio ex nihilo just is hard for, it's just, it's incoherent. I don't know if I would say it's logically incoherent, but it certainly seems to be incoherent in the sense of there doesn't seem to be any like legitimate linguistic meaning, like any actual meaning behind what that concept is. Or at least that when you analyze it, it just seems, it just doesn't make any sense. God didn't create anything at all out of anything. That seems to be what creatio ex nihilo ultimately is saying. Said it's not saying that there is a thing that which God acted on to create and that thing was a nothing. It's saying that God did not act on anything at all in order to create. But then in what sense does it make to say that God created? Well, it just confuses me.
Time we should
I was about to
agree
say-
to disagree.
Yeah, I was about to say, we do want to get to like the main meat of the disagreement, which is the view of timeless sans creation. So that's really what we're coming up to, and we've got a good 20 minutes or something like that to talk about that. So Dr. Craig, yeah, you defend the view that God is timeless sans creation and temporal with creation. So can you explain a bit to the audience, firstly, what that means, and then secondly, maybe sketch a little bit about why you think that's true?
Okay, well, as strange as this view sounds, it does seem to me to be the best view of God and time and is entirely plausible. Suppose you adopt a relational view of time. Well, in that case, with the beginning of the past series of temporal events, there were no events going on prior to creation. Creation was the first event. We don't want to say, I think, that God has lived through an infinite regress of events, because this would just cause all sorts of problems. So on a relational view, there just wouldn't be any time prior to creation. Time begins with the occurrence of the first event at when God creates the world. On the other hand, if we adopt a substantival view of time, then God is the creator of all things, must be the creator of time itself. And therefore, God must be timeless without creation, since he creates time. So on either a relational view or substantival view, it seems to me that God must be timeless sans creation. But once time begins, can God be timeless? Well, here I think it's very difficult to see how God can be timeless if he coexists with the temporal world. In view of his real causal relationship to temporal things and his knowledge of tensed facts, which would be constantly changing. So it seems to me that God must be in time since the moment of creation.
All right. And Ryan, of course.
And the funny thing that something that I think is just rather interesting is that I think that a tenseless view would fit better with the notion of God existing than a tensed view would. Simply because it would allow God to possess knowledge of all moments of time, because all moments of time are equally real. It has all moments of time have truth makers for the facts in them, and things of that nature. Now, I mean, I would object to the following argument, but I think that it could be made that you can still argue that the first instant of time was created by God, but that the whole thing is still a tenseless thing, that which was created by and or is sustained by God. Now, I have reasons for disagreeing with that, but I do think a tenseless view can fit with the existence of God. But I would say that under a tenseless view, with respect to like the beginning of the universe and the creation of the universe and all that stuff, God just becomes superfluous at that point.
And of course, you're not the biggest fan of the view that God is timeless sans creation. So why is that?
Well, so I should say I used to be, because when I was 19 years old, I bought 2 books to try to understand God and time better. One was Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, that didn't help me out at all. And then the other one was Craig's Time and Eternity. And so I was like, oh, this is amazing. This is the best stuff ever. So for the longest time, I was like, Bill, whatever you're saying, it's got to be gospel truth. But now I want to push back. So here's the idea. So here's a question I get a lot from a lot of different philosophers. Some who are really sympathetic to divine temporality, others who want to reject it. They'll go, what exactly does it mean to say that God is timeless without creation and temporal with creation? What's the relationship between those two different phases of God's life? And so this is where you could run different kinds of objections. So you can't say that this timeless phase is temporally before. And like Bill, like we all know you don't want to do that because then you'd be saying God's temporal before he's temporal. That's crazy. And that's why you want to say he's timeless sans without, right? But yeah, I don't think you can say that the timeless phase is causally prior to the temporal phase either. And this is for two reasons. So first, I take it to be a basic causal principle that efficient causes are temporally prior to their effects, in which case the timeless phase would be temporally prior to the temporal phase, and that's going to be incoherent. And then second, so Bill, correct me if I'm wrong here, but if I understand the view correctly, the timeless phase is not causing anything. The temporal phase is simultaneously causing the universe at the first moment of time. So God is the temporal phase of God is simultaneously causing the universe to exist at the first moment of time. And if that's the case, then there's no causal priority before the timeless phase and the temporal phase, because the timeless phase isn't causing anything. He's eternally willing or desiring that a universe exists, but the temporal phase is the thing doing all the causal work. And then I don't think mere logical priority can capture the relationship between a timeless and a temporal phase either. This is because relations of logical priority, they can only obtain between things that are mutually compatible, like the premises and conclusion of a valid argument. So relations of logical priority, they cannot obtain between incompatible states of affairs. So for example, consider the classical theistic claim that from all eternity, the Father timelessly causes the Son to timelessly exist. So you've got a timeless cause with a timeless effect, and so they're always there together. But there's no existence or co-eternal. God's logically prior to creation, but both are going to be co-eternal. And so as Alan Rhoda points out, logical priority cannot be captured by incompatible states of affairs, such as God is others. How it's going to be considered God's logical priority.
Well, I've already suggested reasons why we should think that God does not endure through an infinite regress of temporal events. And I think that we can affirm.
The thing that I think that Dr. Craig is going to say from the work that he's written, that I've read, and from what I've heard him talk about with respect to this, is that the very ontology of time comes about in virtue of God having made the decision to create the universe. That prior to this, there are no concatenated ontological states of affairs successively through which God endures in an ontological sense, that there's God. And in this ontological state, God apprehends all things uniformly and singularly. There's no time, there's no change, there's no moments, there's no succession. And then God freely chooses to bring the universe into existence, creating an event after which all other moments successively concatenate and through which God endures successively as well. It would be as if, and this is an example Dr. Craig himself has used before, it would be as if there had been a man, and it's in a somewhat of a contrived example, but it helps make the point that imagine if there had been a man sitting down from eternity past, quote unquote. There's been a man that has always been sitting down who suddenly freely chose to stand up. That action, now any other action or moment that occurs concatenates after this event in a successive way. And thus time has been brought into existence in virtue of an event happening. And so in this way, time really can't go back out of existence. The only way for something like that to happen, at least from Dr. Craig's view, being a relationist, would be if there just were no relations through which one could define some sort of change. It would just be sort of like a unified moment. So that's sort of how Craig views time, that its ontology, its very ontology, consists in God having made a decision.
Affirm God's causal priority to the universe if we think of a cause as the causal agent who, at the first moment of creation, acted to bring the universe into being. Clearly, that agent did not come into being at the first moment of creation. So the agent cause of the origin of the universe does exist, I think, causally prior to the.
And see, the notion, what is causal priority in this sense, if not ultimately or fundamentally some form of temporal priority? I understand that Dr. Craig views time as metaphysical rather than merely physical, but I must say I don't think I've ever heard Dr. Craig hash out a meaningful theory of cause, or model rather, of causation that he holds to, that which he can ground, in which rather he can ground the claim that causality is some sort of metaphysical notion. You don't need a physical reality or physical substrates or relations between specifically physical substrates alone in order to define causality. And I would disagree with that. And that's where I would be interested in what sort of theory or model of causation that Dr. Craig works with, because I've read some books that he's written on time and some stuff on causation, but I haven't ever heard him say, oh, well, I hold to a counterfactual theory or a regularity theory or a dispositions-based theory or a process-based theory or something like that. Does he think that causality is transitive? I mean, I don't know exactly, and there's a lot to be said about the metaphysics of causation, but it's something that I don't feel Dr. Craig has ever really gone that in depth with respect to. And so it's really hard to understand what he means when he says like causally prior, because he at least as far as I have seen, he doesn't have like a meaningfully hashed out model of causation.
The existence of time in the universe. But I also think that we could construe God as being logically prior to creation. I disagree that logically incompatible states of affairs cannot stand in relations of logical priority. Take Alan Rhoda's example. The state of affairs, God is undecided as to whether or not he will create. And the state of affairs, God is creating a universe. Well, that just is the classic Christian doctrine concerning God's freedom to create or to refrain from creation. Logically, prior to God's decree to create a world, God is undecided as to whether or not he will create. So it seems to me.
Well, I mean, for me, that just raises issues of, I don't know what it means for an omnipotent being to be undecided about something. That confuses me. What does it mean to say that an omnipotent being is undecided? An all-powerful being does not know what decision it wants to make. An omniscient being does not know what decision it wants to make. I don't even understand what that means. That would be my objection there, quite frankly.
Quite wrong to say that logically incompatible states of affairs can't stand in relations of logical priority. Finally, I think we could say that God is ontologically prior to creation in the simple sense that he does not come into being at the moment of creation. Rather, as Ryan insists, God exists alone without creation, and in that sense, he's ontologically prior to creation.
Mm-hmm. So I want to make sure I get this. So there's three reasons you mentioned.
You know, the interesting thing here that I'm starting to ponder is, how would Dr. Craig answer the question, sure, but what do you mean by prior when you say either logically or ontologically prior? What do you mean by that? And I think that Dr. Craig, I could be wrong. I very much could be wrong, but I feel that he might have some difficulty hashing out what he means by prior in ways that don't include temporal notions, and that also aren't circular and don't just refer back to the concept he's trying to use that term within. And so I think that it might be possible, for one, and I'm kind of just thinking out loud here, but I think that it might be possible for one to object to this by saying that the notion of prior, or priority in the sense of the word prior, is just intrinsically a temporal notion. So I don't know what it would mean to say that something is ontologically prior if that's not to say that it exists temporally prior to something else. And logical priority, I would need that one to be hashed out a little bit more, I guess.
Mentioned, so infinite regress sort of reasons, and then you want to say, Rhoda, I love you, but you're just wrong. You can have these inconsistent or incompatible states of affairs.
And I also redefended causal priority if we think of it in not as event causation, but in terms of agent causation.
And then so that's the ontological priority here we're talking about.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So the infinite regress, that's fine. I don't, because I want to avoid an infinite regress. I don't want to have an infinite past at all. And so Swinburne has changed his views on this over the years. And so Swinburne and Dean Zimmerman, they're going to say, yeah, so when God exists all alone, when there's pre-creation moment, it's a moment that doesn't begin to exist, but it's a single moment because it's not preceded by non-existence. And I now understand where you're going to be like, I don't like that. I don't like that. But that's one of the moves they're going to make and say, like, I can agree with you. Yeah, we don't have an infinite regress. And there's some different Islamic thinkers too who do this historically. They're the minority view, but there's a few of them who have this view that looks remarkably like Swinburne's. We've got God all alone, and they say, yeah, is not preceded by non-existence, so that's fine. And for all the Kalam kind of reasons, and then they go, and from after once God creates, though, then you get the succession of all these moments from there. So the first moment, in a sense, is this pre-creation state of affairs.
Could I interrupt?
So you avoid the infinite regress.
At this point, could I interrupt, please?
Yeah, go for it.
That view is perfectly acceptable to me. That is a view that I characterize as the Oxford school of thinking about divine eternity, which characterized Richard Swinburne, Alan Paget, and John Lucas. And I'm happy with that view. And I think it's an alternative to my view. So if that's your view, great, go for it. I don't have an well, I do have objections to it.
There you go.
I think, as I've explained in the book, God, Time, and Eternity, I think that my view is more plausible than yours, than that view, the Oxford School view. But it is an acceptable view philosophically and theologically. So I think that really.
Let's look at the two others. Let's look at so you wanted to push back on Alan Rhoda's claim. So is the move that Kate tries to bear your logical problem. God deciding whether or not to create. He's undecided.
Yeah, can I interrupt again at this point?
Yeah.
Alrighty. So what that one, I'm not gonna lie, I'm getting a little bit bored with that one. So let's jump into the final one. And this is probably where most of the meat of this discussion is going to lie, is with this following video. This one is somebody who, oh my God,
definitely.
why does it keep doing that? Stop it. Clicking full screen does not mean play the fucking video. Jesus. But this is Parker that you're seeing on the screen, and his glorious mustache and his glorious hair as well. I mean, that actually is a handsome guy. That mustache is just something else. His channel is Parker's Pensies. I actually believe I have him tagged in the description down below. But he had a discussion with the one and only Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy about quantum mechanics, theistic idealism, and the simulation hypothesis. I thought it was an interesting discussion. I did listen to the whole video prior to this, prior to the stream that I'm doing now, not just immediately prior, but like 2 or 3 days ago. And it's the one that, because I saw the one video, the first one, then I saw the video from Joe Schmid, the one that we just got done watching. Then I saw this, and once I saw this, I was like, okay, these darn apologists keep talking about physics, and they're getting a lot of stuff wrong. So that's where this stream came from. This was the sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, as they say. But yeah, let's see what they have to say. Let me stop rambling and see what we've got here.
Everything. Here we go. Michael, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, definitely. I started listening to your stuff years and years and years ago, and I was listening to like a couple different videos you had, and I didn't.
Like I was years and years and years ago, like IP's been doing this for like 15, 20 years. When he started his YouTube channel, I think in like 2014, 2013, something like that. Most of his videos, like his first videos on the digital physics argument and the introspective argument and all that stuff, I think, because he redid them. Not that that's a bad thing or anything, but he just kind of updated some things, added in some new information he thought further bolstered his point. But the original ones, I think, were from like 2015 or 2016. So yeah, IP has been doing this for quite some time now. About 7, 8 years, I want to say, maybe 9.
I didn't even know they were by you. Like Man or Rabbit, I saw that one like way back. That was awesome. Started getting into C.S. Lewis, but then just some like general kind of philosophy type stuff. And then I watched another one and saw you were a Christian. It like blew my mind. I was like, bro, we got one on YouTube here. One of these guys is a Christian. So been following you for a long time, and the idealism stuff freaked me out. But now, dude, you're convincing me. I'm real close. So I want to jump in on that. But before we get into like computational type stuff, just a curiosity question. Where did the name Inspiring Philosophy come from?
Everyone asks me that. I'm always like, not really a good story. I was trying YouTube handles, and I wanted like a more official name. So I tried a couple different ones, something around philosophy, and finally I got Inspiring Philosophy. I'm like, oh, good, no one's taken this one yet, so I went with it. So that's how I got it.
So I was just muted for that 10 seconds I was talking there. Yeah, I don't know what's up with the skipping on YouTube. Like I said, my bars are still good. My signal's good. I just wanted to let you, because I don't know what that is. So I apologize for that.
Nice. That's awesome. Well, here's another one for you. This has become more and more important to me to get definitions from people. What do you think philosophy is? Like when you think about philosophy, what do you take that to be?
So I take it to be the basis of all knowledge before we can start doing.
Come on now, Titan. You know he's my favorite apologist. He just says so many juicy things. Like I said, this video is probably going to be the meat of most of the response that I provide. So this one should be fun.
Doing other subjects, we have to do philosophy. So we're going to start doing mathematics. We have to understand, what is mathematics? Why is mathematics important? Same with science, same with history. So it's really the first step I think humans take in acquiring knowledge. We begin with studying wisdom. What is the point of all this? Where do we go from here? So that's why I like philosophy so much, because I think it's the gateway into so many other subjects.
Yeah. No, I'm totally with you. I've always or I've been telling people, like, it's kind of like a back door on a lot of stuff. If you study some good philosophy, it will help you understand a lot of other things more quickly. And you can see a lot of the subject you get, biophysics and biochemistry, all that stuff. So that's good. I mean, do you like the definition, the love of wisdom, or is there?
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm in this like long, super impious. If you don't, like, what? No, that doesn't capture what we're doing at all. Well, dude, here's the easy one for you. Do we live in a computer simulation?
No, we don't live in a computer simulation. We're not in a computer, in my view.
Okay.
Ditto. We do not live in we don't live in any form of simulation.
It's possible. I just don't think that's what we were actually in.
Yeah, I also agree. I think it's I suppose that I can't derive some sort of logical contradiction that shows that we can't live in a simulation, but I don't think the idea is very likely at all.
Yeah. I mean, so you get into like quantum physics and stuff, and
Ooh, my favorite.
the collapse of the wave function.
It's actually my second
upon
favorite.
Being observed.
Cosmology
Like,
is my
that
favorite.
does a lot of work in your theory, right?
Yeah, so I am an idealist. I do think
Yeah.
we live in something that would be like a simulation, but I don't
Yeah.
think we actually live in a computer. Like we're not running, we're not software on a hard drive.
Yeah.
But idealism is just basically the idea that all is mind,
Mhm.
in opposed to physicalism, which says all is physical substances or all is particles, all is something physical. I say all is mind. So we do live in something that would be like an information reality. That's what the physical would be. It'd be information contingent upon mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
The question there is what's the connection then between like the physical and the mental? What makes physical information have to why does there have to be a connection to a mind? I don't know. Why can't there just be physical information?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that too. So, like, what do you think is most fundamental? Do you think information is most fundamental, or like mathematics? You know, or is math just another form of information? What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I don't think it'd be most fundamental to reality because information itself it would have to be contingent upon something else. Information, I don't think, can exist in and of by itself. Something
Yeah.
has to process information.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, what is the basis of reality? Would be mind or consciousness. Mind itself is fundamental. It cannot be reduced to anything other. It just simply is. It can be explained in its own
Hold on,
terms
what?
to any
Hold on
or
here.
consciousness. Mind itself is fundamental. It cannot be reduced to anything other. It just simply is. It can be explained in its own terms, in terms of what it is, without appealing to something else that built up mind or consciousness.
So my question would be, okay, so then what is mind? And anybody that knows me knows that the question I'm going to ask next is going to be, what model of causality, what model of causation do you use? How does this mind interact with how does mind causally produce the physical world? Is it a causal production? If not, then what sort of relation is it, if not some sort of causal relation? Supervenience relation? Does the physical emerge in some sort of way out of the mind? Is it some sort of like ontological dependence or some broader metaphysical grounding? What's going on here and how does it work? Not saying that IP couldn't answer or like, you know, respond to these questions, just saying that these are questions that I would have.
Yeah.
It just simply is. And so that's on my view, on an idealist view, is that consciousness is fundamental. Matter reduces to information, which is being processed through minds or a mind, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. That's a helpful distinction. There's this really good Cambridge Elements book, God and Abstract Objects, and I don't know how to say his name. I think it's Bon. He makes this argument about information being most fundamental because it is like substrate independent. It can be carried on like any kind of substrate, like a tennis ball.
See, you'll hear this a lot, that, well, information is a non-physical thing. It just needs, you know, it might have a physical substrate. What it's carried or contained in might be physical, but the information itself, and immediately my response to that would be, well, sure, but all that means is that information is some sort of abstract notion that we ascribe to, like, perhaps properties or tropes of some sort that instantiate in things. And then I'm just going to be a nominalist about those. Or to go into more depth, what I would say is that information isn't something over and above these physical substrates and substances and relations. It is the physical substrates and relations. So like information isn't carried by electrons and atoms and molecules and objects. The objects and the electrons and the atoms and the relations and the structures, that stuff is the information. The information is the structure and the organization and all that stuff that that is held by these physical substrates. And the thing is, the vast majority of people working in information theory and, you know, quantum information theory and you know, statistical mechanics and how that relates to information theory and all that stuff in physics as it relates to information, or rather information theory as it relates to physics, they're all going to say the same thing. Information is a physical thing.
Has information like about its roundness and its color and all this stuff, but you can translate that into something else, but yet you don't have anything without information. And so he would say like, yeah, information is most fundamental. But I like your point about like, you know, the mind's more fundamental, but what is mind then?
That's a good question.
Well, I mean, when people ask that, they typically want it explained into something else. And my response is, mind is simply fundamental. You can't,
you know what, let me just
explain it by appealing to something beyond itself. So
Yeah.
take Democritus' view of the atoms, the ancient Greek philosopher. He would not, if you were to ask him, well, what are the atoms? He'd be like, well, they just are. They build everything else. They can't reduce to anything beyond themselves. And that's my view about mind. It just simply is fundamental. It cannot go.
It seems to me that what IP is just saying here is, yeah, there are no I just realized where I paused it. There are no properties that it possesses that I can tell you about. I mean, of course he would object to that. And I would just say, so what are these properties and how did you come to know that this substance or substrate or whatever it is that you're calling that is mind possesses those properties? How did you come, what are the properties and how did you come to know that they are possessed by this thing? Because the thing is, like, let me just say that, like, quantum fields are like the fundamental thing in reality. They aren't made of, and there is nothing below them that they are constructed of. I wouldn't just say that, though. I can still say what quantum fields are. They possess energy. They have degrees of freedom with respect to, say, things like virtual particles. They're physically real, and we can measure effects that they have on things. There's still going to be something of substance. As somebody like Aaron Ra would say, there's still going to be a there. What is the mind? Just saying, well, there's this thing there that's mind, and it's fundamental, and it's not construed in terms of anything else. Well, that's fine. It doesn't need to be construed in terms of anything else for you to tell me what it is. It could have properties, but just not possess properties in virtue of anything else. Now, that might not jive well with Michael, because he's a bundle theorist, and I am also a bundle theorist, which means that we believe that what objects are is nothing more than the bundle of properties that makes them up. That's sort of a simplistic way of putting it. But I don't think that saying that something is fundamental and is not construed of anything more fundamental, elementary, or underlying to it doesn't mean that you still can't tell me about it. And thus far, at least, Michael hasn't told me anything about what mind is.
Go beyond something else to explain it.
Do you think that it's like a substance though? Like, would you say that mind is a immaterial substance?
Yeah, I would say it's the fundamental substance, so to speak, of all of reality.
Yeah, what properties does it have? How did you know that it's there? In what ways did you interact with it to know that it's there? How did you verify that that's what it is? How did you derive what the properties of it are? Outline what those processes and mechanisms are or were. Like, this really isn't hard. And you know, anybody that comes to me and says, look, I'm not really going to be able to provide that kind of framework for what this is, then I'm just going to look at you and say, well, then why should I believe it? Why should I accept that this is a thing? And certainly, why should I accept that it has some sort of causal interaction with what I perceive as the external physical reality? Like, if there's no substance to the worldview, why should I hold to it?
So since I'm a theist, I would say that the basis of reality is God. He is a mind, and he is what created everything else. And everything that he created, like our world, is like an information world that is sort of like contingent upon his mind, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so then, you know, we operate in that reality.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so fascinating. So Okay, when you talk about like you got a great playlist on this about emergent God, emergent world. The world that we live in, the physical reality that we perceive is physical things are emergent out of information. Is that the right way to say it?
Yeah, so the idea is that if we start to study what the physical is from a philosophical and scientific perspective, they both converge to the same point, which is that we're not reducing to a substance.
Mhm.
So if you were to take an apple, for example, you could reducing to a substance. Scientific perspective, they both converge to the same point, which is that we're not reducing to a substance.
Mhm.
So if you were to take an apple, for example, you could reduce it.
Sound like you said that science and philosophy are converging on the conclusion that when we start to examine what the physical is, we're not reducing to a substance. I think that's just false. Well, I would object to the notion of reduction. I mean, I think reduction is somewhat meaningful. I mean, it's not like dumb or anything. I just prefer emergence. I think reduction is sort of top down, whereas emergence is sort of bottom up. And I think that the best way to understand reality, the best framework, is a bottom up rather than a top down framework. Things don't reduce from the top to the bottom; they emerge from the bottom upward, or rather from the in out, or from the bottom up. Anyway, I don't even remember what I was going to say. Hold on here.
It to its property.
Oh yeah, the notion that it doesn't either reduce to or emerge from some sort of substance. I think that's just false. It seems that at least thus far within physics, the metaphysics of science and the philosophy of physics, what are best models, best theories, best principles and paradigms, the most parsimonious and theoretically virtuous explanations that we have, models that we have, seem to tell us that quantum fields are, again, at least thus far, the most fundamental thing that exists. They are physical, they are actually ontically real, physical, and they are a substance that we can causally interact with, and that can causally interact with other things, and we can measure this. And that everything else in reality, through a variety of technicalities associated with scale, emergence, and what have you, everything else fundamentally comes out of these quantum fields and how they couple to and engage in and dance, so to speak, with one another. So that's going to be the view that we have. The idea that this all doesn't reduce down to a substance, I just think is patently incorrect with respect to where the physics and the philosophy of physics really stands.
You can explain it in terms of its color, its shape, its roundness, how it feels. But all of these are not properties of some sort of physical substance that we would call the apple. They are just mental properties, qualia. Qualia is something you experience in your mental reality, like the color of something. Okay,
Yeah.
the color does not need to be. Color is what happens on a physicalist point, is when different wavelengths hit the eye, create a chemical reaction, and they create an electrical signal in the brain. And you experience color, but color does not exist as part of that physical thing you're viewing. Okay, well then, if all that.
Well, I mean, I don't think that's really correct. I think it does. I mean, I think it's just blatantly obvious that what color is it either is or it consists in a difference in the frequency of electromagnetic radiation. If you want to say that our ability to experience the difference between them, is what color is rather than the actual difference, it's our ability to perceive that difference, that's fine. I'm not going to object to that. And then it would be true that, like, if humans didn't exist, color wouldn't. What color ultimately consists in, i.e. different frequencies of electromagnetic radiation, would still exist. But our ability to interpret and understand that as color would not. Yeah, that's fine. But I don't think it's right to say that, like, color isn't ultimately some sort of physical notion. It's fundamentally rooted in a physical difference between a physical substrate, i.e. different frequencies of the electromagnetic radiation. And everything that is associated with our ability to understand and perceive it is itself physical. Our eyes, the electrochemical and other neurophysiological processes associated with the reception, processing, storage, memory, recollection, and all the other things that occur when we see things of whatever colors and patterns and textures that we're seeing them. So yeah, I think that all of this is thoroughly rooted in the physical, and I think that this is reasonably well understood, particularly by those studying, visual processes in the brain.
That applies to basically every other thing you're experiencing with regards to the apple. The way it feels, the way it tastes, the way it might smell. All of these are mental sensations that allegedly are created by the brain. So the idealist says, well, wait a minute, if everything we're experiencing is mental in terms of a physical apple, well, then why are we positing a physical reality beyond the mental world we experience? Everything with regards to the apple can be reduced to information about it. And this is called bundle theory that goes back to David Hume, which is that physical objects, according to the modern idealist, is that they're just a bundle of different properties.
Right.
We don't need to posit a substance, a physical object beyond the mental experience that we would call the essence of the apple. So really, well, the idealist says that's what physical reality is. It's just this mental information. Scientifically, this seems to be pointing in this direction, because when we study the base of all of our physical reality, we don't find a substance. People used to think it was fundamental particles. Well, no, I mean, we now know that particles are like these different blips in quantum fields, and in quantum field theory, they don't have to be physical substances. So people said, well, maybe quantum fields are the basis of reality. But then David John Baker in 2008 wrote his paper Against Field Interpretations of Quantum Field Theory, and pointed out all the same problems we have with a particle interpretation apply to a field interpretation. Fields.
So I have actually skimmed David John Baker's paper Against Field Interpretations of Quantum Field Theory, or something like that, I believe is what it's called. Now it needs to be said, I'm not an expert in quantum field theory. I do have I would argue, meaningful, I'm at least competent with some of the baseline mathematics associated with it. And while it is true that quantum fields can be understood, there's a sort of I guess you could call it a mathematical technique to build them up by superimposing Fock spaces of many particles onto one another. So you have like a 0 particle Fock space, a 1 particle Fock space, a 2 particle Fock space, a 3 particle Fock space. And that what a quantum field is a superposition of all of these various multipartite Fock spaces. And so I think if I'm, number one, if I'm remembering correctly, and number two, if I'm interpreting correctly, what Baker's objection is that, well, if we're constructing it that way, then at the end of the day, the same issues that arise in those particle interpretations are going to arise in the field interpretations that are built from them. And so we're not really going to be able to use quantum field theory to avoid some of these aspects of the not aspects but problems of these particle interpretations. But the issue there is that while you can understand a quantum field as sort of a superposition of a variety of like particle states, multipartite like Fock spaces, which represent particle states of 1, 2, 3. That's why I meant by multipartite 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 up to potentially an infinite amount of particles. That isn't what a quantum field is in like the ontological sense. And the main difference is that you don't use particle operators, you use field operators. And so that there are still going to be meaningful differences through which we're going to be able to avoid a lot of these objections that are raised with particle interpretations. We can, in fact, overcome them with field interpretations because of how the nature of quantum field theory is constructed.
Or just information as well.
Also, I am speaking a little bit, it is a little bit flowery or a little bit facetious when I use this word, but it is somewhat frustrating that Michael is sort of touting David Baker's paper as if like it's a knockdown, drag out. Oh, that what it 100% shows that field interpretations are always going to have the same problems as particle interpretations. Because there are people that disagree with it. Most philosophers of physics are probably going to disagree with a lot of what he says. So it's just citing this one paper and as if like it's a defeater, a thorough defeater for field interpretations. I just don't think is the right way to look at it.
So everything we experience in reality just reduces to information, according to the latest science. Same within philosophy. We study.
Well, it doesn't really reduce to information so much as information is obviously an important tool in understanding and quantifying the physical systems that we're trying to understand and describe.
Objects according to their properties. It just reduces to these mental experiences we're having. So the idealist is just saying, cut out all the extra baggage of some sort of separate physical reality beyond our mental experiences and just say what it is. We experience a mental world. Everything is mind. Everything is mind or is information that is processed in mind. And that information is what we call physical reality. So that's where the idealist gets his arguments from. And I have many different ways I can argue for this.
Yeah, dude, I really like it. So one thing, I'm trying to anticipate stuff from the listeners. Someone might say, well, look, bundle theory, this is from like the first person perspective, that like this lamp I'm looking at, it's just a bundle of properties, all that good stuff. Yeah. Someone like the naive realist or someone or indirect realist, whoever would say like, there's still something there producing those properties. So maybe I can't like get to the thing in and of itself, maybe, and the Kantians are all clapping and stuff, but there still seems to be something outside of me that's producing that. Even if we're in like, a simulated world or God's mind or something. So like this, I don't know, it might be like someone might say there's like an illicit shift from like the first person to like a third person, like, oh, because it appears to me like, bundle theory or whatever, there's a bunch of properties. Therefore, everything just actually is. And I'm living in someone else's mind. Do you get that objection? You see where I'm trying to grasp at here?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to disagree. I do think there is something creating those properties. And this is why I tend to compare idealism to worlds that are in video games.
Sure.
So if you're playing a video game and your avatar walks into a room and you see a cup on a table,
here we go.
and then you leave the room, is the cup still there on the table? Well, no, it's not a real table. All that it would be there is just ones and zeros, the computer code.
Yeah.
But when you turn and look back at the cup, it's going to appear as a physical cup. Likewise, that would be how my view on idealism works, is that, there is this underlying information. So if I go around the corner in my room and I see a cup on the table, the cup is always going to be there in an information sense, even though the physical manifestation of it doesn't show up until I look at it.
Yeah.
So with that idea, there is
There we go.
this sort of information reality that we don't control, we don't create, we cannot bend it to our will. We just participate in it.
Yeah.
We cause the physical appearance of something when we interact with it.
So
Okay. I don't think that's true. I don't think physics tells us that's true. I think that the deterministic nature of most of the classical physical equations that are used kind of established that, like, yes, the moon is still there even when I'm not looking at it or I can't see it.
I caught that in one of your videos when you're arguing against solipsism. I thought that was a really fascinating argument to go from solipsism. Another thinker that you were quoting, you said, collapses to realism, and you're like, no, I don't think so. I think it collapses all the way back to idealism. I thought that was a sweet move. I've heard on the simulation hypothesis, and I want to distinguish. I want to say, like, I don't know, naturalistic simulation hypothesis, where people are positing like a humanoid simulator, one level of reality below ours, not theistic idealism. They'll argue about the collapse of the wave function. They'll say, look, that's just because when you're looking at the electron, it renders, and of course now it looks like a particle because it actually is saving RAM or something by only rendering what's being perceived. And so, boom, it's kind of like idealism, but that explains, quantum mechanics. Are you making a similar move here, or how would you interact with someone who's trying to argue that, like, no, we don't live in God's mind. We live in, a actual simulated world, and the collapse of the wave function actually evidence for, saving RAM or something like that.
Yeah, I don't think that would actually get us there.
Mhm.
There's really no. I know there have been some tests to see if we live in a simulation. They didn't come out as the researchers had suspected. They came out as the researchers had suspected. They don't.
Yeah.
Those specific tests don't point to us living in an actual computer simulation. But I mean, like, saving RAM, I don't really think that would necessarily follow. And
Yeah.
the way I sort of argue against that is more philosophical. If
Mhm.
our world is living in is a simulation on a computer, then is that world have fundamental particles which create it?
I know many of you are probably cringing over Parker consistently referencing the collapse of the wave function. I'm going to get to it. I'm waiting for IP to say something. I'm waiting for Michael to say something about it before I say anything.
Which is different from our worlds.
Right.
Okay, well then it's got to be simulated by another computer, and then so on and so on. So instead of it being all turtles all the way down, is it
Yeah.
computers all the way down?
Yeah.
So you have to posit this really complicated world that is sort of creating our computer simulation. It's not the same physics as ours. You have to posit a whole new realm of physics, which is undetectable.
Mhm.
That's getting ad hoc. It's multiplying entities beyond necessity.
Right.
It's far more simpler, more parsimonious of an explanation to say that we are just being stimulated by one mind versus all this convoluted physics to explain this other reality that built the computer.
Yeah.
So it just becomes a simpler explanation in my view.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I used to think simulation hypothesis was like this huge rival coming up against Christianity and theism. And now more and more I'm seeing like, well, dude, you're kind of just stepping over into our field. And now we don't need to multiply entities. Let's shave off some stuff. And you still need a necessary being. And I still have lots of arguments for that kind of God. So it's really fascinating. I'm really actually excited now that it's been taken off in culture. And it's cool that you've been working on this stuff already, and you just have it all here ready for us. So when it comes to like the emergence of the physical, there's a couple different ways that I think we could probably think about it. Like God is a spiritual being, and he's thinking kind of like rose out of him, food, or like impious, dependent on him. God's thoughts, like inside of God, inside of his mind. Out of those two conceptions, maybe you have another one that you like better, but what do you make of that? Which one do you think we actually is the case? Yeah.
Well, these are two different views. Panentheism. So pantheism is the idea all is God.
Yeah.
Panentheism is the idea all is in God. Traditionally, Christians, especially of the Greek Orthodox approach, have held to a panentheistic approach. This goes back to thinkers like Maximus the Confessor or Gregory Palamas. But it's more of a weak panentheism.
Yeah.
A stronger panentheism would be like that we are part of God's knowledge of, that makes him complete. We're part of his essence. Like he could not, if we disappeared, he would lack knowledge. Weak panentheism doesn't say that. We're not part of God's essence. We're part of his energies. So we're emulating from his energies is what I would say.
Yeah.
So the way you got to think of it is like, I give an analogy. So think of the world of Middle Earth and J.R.R. Tolkien. You would the world about Middle Earth. It just doesn't believe J.R.R. Tolkien from his energy. That's where we are. And so it's sort of like that. It's a mental reality created by God, but is not entirely part of his knowledge. So that's the difference between weak and strong panentheism. And weak panentheism is what the Greek Orthodox Church would advocate for, not strong panentheism.
Yeah. Yeah. I like it, from Palamas, I think. Palamite panentheism. And I thought that was helpful. Master's thesis, one of them on the authorial analogy for the God-world relation. So it's super close to like we live in God's dream or, we live in God's mind. But I still wanted to hold on to like the external world type thing. So we live in like a theodrama. We live in like the novel. But then, something that made me super uncomfortable was like, well, that novel is dreamed up in the author's head first. So like, where does like Middle Earth existed in that.
I'm
like,
sorry,
it's
I'm
already
just skipping
been
ahead
there.
to like some more
So,
interesting stuff rather
guys
than
keep-
like talking about Middle Earth
whether,
and how like
these are your thoughts.
we're nothing more than a
and
novel that God
go
is like writing in his head or something like that.
Your thoughts, or
I'm just
what
sorry,
do you
that's just
think
not
of-
very interesting. I'm just looking.
Well, I mean, it's hard to say. Sometimes we feel like we have thoughts that are not our own. We feel intrusive. We call them intrusive thoughts.
Sure.
This is a very complicated question.
Yes, Maya. A lot of the stuff that Praise says with respect to idealism and quantum mechanics and God and all that, he got from inspiring philosophy and some others. Yes, that is exactly where he got it from.
In philosophy of mind, what are thoughts?
Yeah.
But let's take some cues from some.
What? Why do I keep pausing this at when I piece? I swear to God, I'm not doing it purposefully.
Authors here. Let's go back to J.R.R. Tolkien, for example. When he was writing Lord of the Rings, he felt sometimes that the characters were taking on a life of their own.
Yeah.
They were doing things he didn't expect they were going to do.
Yeah.
So at one point he says that he was writing and he wrote that Galadriel said, "I passed the test," and he had to sit back with that.
Yeah.
The story of this dreams, where you have your mind doing it yourself.
But it had none of your characteristics. It's like, well, then that's just a name referring to a different thing. Because like there's a concept of you that like you can't change so much that it wouldn't be you anymore. And so like if God wants to create this character, Michael Jones, he's gonna have to be, I don't this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think there's something there in like the concept of the person maybe. And
issue around the guise of the good. I don't think it's possible to do something without good intentions, or if you're seeking something good. Evil is just the corrupt way of obtaining those things. So it's impossible to do evil just for the sake of evil, in my view. You're always going to do evil for the sake of something good, ultimately. It's just a corrupted form of it. So that's my view on it.
Yeah. What about like
I think a discussion on the argument from evil would be interesting to have with Michael, honestly.
Satan tempting Adam and Eve? What
I don't care.
we don't, it feels like wrong to attribute these to God, or to have God feel these emotions. So this one might be different. So we're saying like evil isn't a substance that like
Okay. Yeah, they get back into the physics stuff at some point.
We don't have like separate. We don't have separate existence. Like we don't exist outside of God. So then, but if you can still make that distinction on idealism, then it's like, okay.
I don't think it's a problem, because I just go back to the analogy of consciousness that collapses the wave function. I don't think God has to. I think he creates the quote code of the universe, and he's aware of it. But when we conscious beings interact with that code, we create the manifestation of the physical object. And then he is just simply aware of what we're doing and what we're viewing. He doesn't have to be viewing the information reality we live in from a third person perspective. So yeah, I do think it is human consciousness that collapses the wave function.
Do you have any?
So finally, so I'm trying to figure out the best way to like start. Wave functions are not physical objects. A wave function is a mathematical function that I believe represents the weighted set of potential values that could be held for some observable in a quantum system. You can input the wave function into the Schrödinger equation, and it will tell you how those probabilities will evolve in time, and it will do so deterministically. When you collapse the wave function, a better phrase is reduction of the state vector, because that's what occurs mathematically. This has literally nothing to do with consciousness. It has to do with some mathematical techniques that are utilized to draw a particular value out of the weighted set for some for some observable, which is being represented by the state vector. If you know your linear algebra, it's a projection of the state vector onto one of the basis states, and then there's some extra calculations and stuff that is done to derive the I believe it is an eigenvalue that corresponds to the observable. Consciousness has nothing to do with it because this isn't a physical process. This is a mathematical process of updating, effectively updating the statistics of a system based on interaction with it by some other system. So it's not that I don't want to sound mean or something like that, but when people talk about like consciousness collapsing the wave function, I question their understanding of quantum mechanics. I question, and what I mean by that is I question the understanding of like the actual mathematical methods that are utilized in the science, because I think that when you understand those, you would be just as baffled as I am by the statement that consciousness has anything at all to do with state vector reduction.
Any thoughts on like how that works? Like is there a mechanism?
That's a good
like
question.
why is it that consciousness does that? It's so weird.
Yeah, well, here's the thing: is that in quantum mechanics, we have a mathematical equation that explains the wave function. We can explain particles in terms of different equations. We don't have an equation that can explain collapse. So we have a wave function, we have particles, something in the middle happens. This is called the measurement problem. How do we go from the wave function to particles? So this is why some physicists like Henry Stapp, for example, have argued that it is consciousness.
It's actually more, how do we go from superpositions to observed states? Like, why is it that we don't ever observe an electron actually in the state of being in a superposition? Why is it that whenever we observe it, it is in a state? It's never in the superposition of states when we observe it. It's always in a state. That's what the measurement problem is. And this is what leads people to think that we need a more foundational philosophical or metaphysical interpretation with respect to quantum mechanics. And this is where I prefer Carlo Rovelli's relational quantum mechanics. We don't observe superpositions because superpositions are what you get when there is no relation that which is held with the system that's in the superposition. You always make a measurement when you measure some quantum object, because when you measure it, you're standing in some sort of interactive relation with it. But when you're not standing in some sort of interactive relation with it, then you're not going to know what state it's in, because what state it's in depends on how you relate to the thing that you're measuring. If you relate to it in different ways, you might get different measurements. And this can explain sort of why we don't observe. You can't observe a superposition because you would have to relate to a system in no relation to observe a superposition under the relational view. And so a superposition is just a system that which doesn't relate to anything in its environment. And so you never, it doesn't make any sense to say that it's in some state, because it being in a state depends on it relating to something else. But that doesn't make it not physically real. That doesn't mean that it doesn't causally interact with other things. It just means that if you're taking an isolated quantum system, something truly in a superposition, that's just to say that it's in a state of not being related to anything outside of it. And that you're not going to know anything about what it's doing until you relate to it. And how you relate to it will determine what it is that you're measuring about it. And this is why I hold to the relational view. I think it meaningfully explains why we observe something like the measurement problem and why it's just really not a problem.
Consciousness causing collapse. And so how it happens is, I would just say it's the same way with you play a video game. You go into a room and then the code manifests a appearance of everything that would be in the room for you to play the game. Same kind of idea. It's just when this information enters into consciousness, it has to appear as something, and so it takes on physical forms. It has to, it has to sort of, if it's going to interact with a conscious agent, it has to appear in some form, and this is just how it appears.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so if let me repeat it back and see if I got it. So it's like,
So it seems to me that what IP is saying is, well, there's this measurement problem because when consciousness interacts with something, it has to appear as something to the consciousness. And that is what quote unquote collapses the way. That's why consciousness collapses it, is because when consciousness looks at a thing, observes a thing, measures or interacts with a thing, there has to be a thing there in a state that's being interacted with. But if there isn't that consciousness there, then it doesn't have to be in a state. That's how I'm interpreting sort of how IP is looking at this. I could be wrong about that, but that's sort of how I'm picking it up.
God may not be actively like, oh shoot, over here, I need to collapse this, but more so like he set up the dream, or he set up the dream world. He set that up with certain psychophysical laws and certain laws that when an observer looks at this, it will collapse. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I should say, quote unquote, collapse of the wave function happens under what I hold to the relational view when the isolated quantum system in a superposition interacts with its environment in a way that that decoheres the superposition of the quantum system, and thus it will be quote unquote observed to be in a state.
So how you have this really great video on I don't know if it's called like the death of materialism or something like that, but it's talking about how materialism, physicalism gets things backwards, where mind doesn't come out of material, but material comes out of mind. Maybe that's the right way of saying it. Mm-hmm. Do you think we have souls?
Well, define what we mean by soul, because the way I define soul would be more in an Aristotelian fashion. So I would say the soul is the combination of your.
There's one thing I have noticed about a lot of apologists, and even some of the younger ones and the more modern ones, is that with a lot of their metaphysical views about things, they appeal to like Thomistic, Anselmian, Aristotelian, a lot of old, and I'm going to say it quite frankly, outdated and maybe even disreputable notions with respect to their metaphysical views on things. And I think that's, at this point, at least I should say, I'm convinced that it has to be because they need to interpret metaphysics that way in order to maintain their theistic view. That metaphysics over the last, I would say probably particularly, somewhere between maybe 50 and 80 years has really naturalized, a lot of metaphysicians are working within a naturalized metaphysics. There's not so much theistic or some sort of like supernatural or preternatural assumptions or presuppositions or other forms of suppositions built into metaphysics in the modern age. It's what is called naturalized metaphysics, that metaphysics in philosophy today is taking a much more natural and naturalist approach to things that sort of precludes a lot of I won't say non-natural, but supernatural, because there is a distinction I won't get into right now. A lot of supernatural notions, in that a lot of these Aristotelian or Anselmian or Thomistic metaphysical notions are just being abandoned because they're not meaningful. What we're currently understanding with respect to physics and chemistry and further developments in mathematics and logic and other areas of philosophy, we don't think about things that way anymore. And it just seems that apologists haven't caught up with that yet. And of course, naturally, no pun intended, they're going to resist the naturalization of metaphysics, because it's obviously not going to serve them any meaningful substantiation.
your personality, your thoughts, your dreams, your emotions, all of that bundled up. That's your soul, and that evolves over time because you have new experiences, you form new memories. So yeah, I do think we have a soul, and I think that does go on after death. And so I would say that everyone is a mind that is building a soul.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I like that. So I like the term like Thomistic dualism, where it's like you are a soul.
What did I just get done saying? You got IP mentioning Aristotelian aspects with respect to metaphysical views about, I think, the mind, and now you have Parker mentioning Thomistic metaphysical view. And look, I get it. As a theist, you're probably gonna resist it. Like I said, the naturalization of metaphysics, but I still think that that's largely the direction that metaphysics is moving. There's been a major naturalization of metaphysics, and these kinds of frameworks just aren't being they're just not being used by metaphysicians anymore. Metaphysicians aren't really examining things in the modern world and the problems that they're working on and the things that they're working on and thinking about, which is largely in like physics and neuroscience and maybe like aspects of biology and sociology. Those are the largest areas where metaphysicians are applying metaphysics today, I would say. They're not using Aristotelian frameworks, Thomistic frameworks, Anselmian frameworks. There's other frameworks that they're not using. That's just the case. This like desperate cleaving to these very, very old, antiquated frameworks, it's not going to help you moving forward. As humans continue to develop, particularly intellectually, our science has gotten much more naturalized. I would say that our sociology and our economics, our legal systems, our social systems have become much more naturalized. Our philosophy has become much more naturalized. And what I mean by that is that sort of taking this at least methodological naturalist approach, that we're not necessarily precluding supernatural things, but we're not starting from the assumption that they're real or that they should be considered until meaningful data comes forward that gives us a reason to. And again, obviously the theists are going to resist that.
And your body is a mode of your soul. So you have properties and an exemplification relation, but you're the substance that's a soul. And that your soul like does the informing of your body. If you're okay, when you say Aristotelian, like, do you split up into like the intellect and stuff like that, or are you not going that fine grained with like what the soul is?
Not necessarily. It's like it's just in a real Aristotelian fashion versus a Platonic understanding of how they would define the soul. Yeah.
Okay, so typically we think maybe like on the folk level, Christian folk level, like we live in this physical reality, and then when we die, our non-physical soul goes to heaven, which is like an immaterial place, and it's just chilling. And most of us don't even think about new heavens and new earth, and we just kind of stop there.
I just have to comment quickly. Just the phrase immaterial place seems a little weird to me, at least. What is an immaterial place? That's a little confusing to me. I mean, maybe there is some meaningful notion of that, but I guess in like the sense you could say that home is a place, but it's not like physical. But I don't know if he means it in that sense or not.
There, maybe we get angel wings. In a idealist view, when you die, is it still right to talk about your soul being separated from your body?
Yeah, and I think quantum mind theory actually kind of does help with that a little bit. So I hold.
What theory? Quantum mind theory. You know what? Let me go. It's actually even considered quantum mind and quantum script hypothesis plus classical mechanics. Okay, that's also okay.
Hold to a quantum mind view that the brain is basically doing quantum computing.
Yeah,
that's how we think and make decisions, and it's very complicated stuff. It's part of my irreducible mind series. I have a whole video in that series on quantum mind.
Yeah, most neuroscientists and most physicists think that quantum mechanics probably plays no major role in consciousness. And, you know, a lot of people say, oh, well, what about birds and the magnetic navigation that they's got that's results of quantum mechanics? And it's like, well, sure, but that doesn't have any real bearing on their consciousness. Like, everything is technically quantum mechanical at the most fundamental level, but our mind, the neurophysiological processes that are occurring are thoroughly at the level of like molecules and large amounts of molecules being exchanged through a variety of pathways in long-term sustained processes. Like, there's just a whole hell of a lot that you could dive into. Quantum mechanics isn't going to play any meaningful role in that any more than it would in how we, you know, like poop. Like, our pooping isn't quantum mechanical simply because that at the fundamental level there are quantum processes involved in what's going on. That's just not the right way to think about it, I would say.
Mind alone. So the mind is basically quantum computing. Now, when we die, according to some quantum mind theories, is that information in the brain is still entangled through quantum entanglement. So it still stays as connected.
Oh man, that's and I'm not saying this about IP because he's not necessarily promoting this. He's just saying that these are ideas out there. So this isn't an attack on IP, but that's definitely some Deepak Chopra level stuff. Through quantum entanglement, the quantum particles of your mind, your consciousness can be maintained. Like, that's that's definitely Deepak Chopra level. Yeah.
It can
that's
disconnect from the brain and continue on. And so that's generally my view, is that when we die,
okay, so it is his view
of the brain disconnects and can continue on.
Okay.
So if you're a Christian, for example, that means possibly, again, I'm speculating here.
Sure.
I can't prove any of this, but maybe in some sense we entangle with Christ in some way, or with God, and maybe
this just completely misunderstands what entanglement is. Entanglement is entirely a physical thing. It doesn't have what? No, that's I don't. I'm debating whether I want to spend the 5 minutes to try to explain what entanglement is, despite the fact that I've done it a number of times, and I'm certain that most people listening to this are probably going to have some familiarity with it. But I suppose it's probably meaningful. That's what we're here for, after all, right? Entanglement is what you get when you have multiple parts of a quantum system that, when you derive the weighted set for values for any observables associated with that part of the system, you will intrinsically get a weighted set for values for observables about other parts of the system. They're connected in a way that you can't get information about one without intrinsically getting some information about the other. Usually in some sort of I don't know if contrapositive, but I think I was a complementary way. But this is entirely physical. This depends on there being physical systems and substrates at the quantum level, and a variety of other aspects associated with them that they're, to get the entanglement the entanglement relations to actually hold. So I don't I don't know what entangle with Christ. I don't know what that means.
Hell is just that entangled information slowly disintegrating out of existence because it has nothing to entangle with. So that kind of is my general idea. And so you continue on. Now, after death, I still think, my view of idealism is that if a conscious agent is in physical reality, it has to look like something.
Yeah.
And that's what you are. You are what you physically are. That is just what a first-person conscious experience appears as. So what I see you, it's a third-person perspective of a first-person conscious experience.
Yeah.
That's what it is. That's what we are. So when we die, if we go to another reality, another plane of existence, we have to manifest as something to appear, and then we'll just re-manifest as a physical being, kind of like this, maybe in some sort of, maybe with different limitations, maybe with less limitations.
Yeah.
I don't entirely know, because we don't know. And so that's generally it. And I compare it again to a dream world. When you dream, you manifest a physical appearance of yourself to interact in the dream. I've had dreams where I'm bleeding out. Why don't I ever dream that I'm naked? Why am I always in clothes? I'm able to manifest that self in my dreams. So likewise, I think after death, wherever we end up, we'll be able to it will just naturally be able to manifest a physical appearance of ourselves in some way or another. Maybe we'll be more ghostly, maybe not. I don't.
Yeah. Okay, so sometimes people will talk about in a similar line of thought, like maybe with NDEs or something, near-death experiences, they'll talk about heaven being more real, right?
Yeah.
But on idealism, it's still, you never escape the dream, and to do so, I actually think that's kind of a Christian doctrine of like, creator creature type stuff, where it's like, yeah, I don't know if we ever actually can escape the dream and like see God, in his fullness as God sees God or something like that. Like, so what do you make of that? Could God like bring us, dream beings into his level of reality?
Dream beings. That's what we are. We are dream beings in God's mind. We are star people. We come from above and within and from everywhere in between. We are infinite.
I don't know,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yeah, all this is speculation.
But I
right?
mean, I don't think logically we could ever do that, because I think it would require us being God.
That's
really,
right. That's what I think too. Right. Yeah.
I think that's the thing, is if God is truly this infinite being, as we talk of him, he's not, and by infinite, I don't mean like an endless long list of numbers.
Yeah, right.
But if he's truly an infinite being, maybe that's what it.
Qualitatively infinite, not quantitatively infinite. That is the distinction, at least as made by William Lane Craig.
Eternity is constantly trying to experience the greatness and the majesty of God, but because he is infinite, it just goes on infinitely, and that's why we can continue to live on for eternity and not get bored. Because we're constantly going to be exploring this amazing creator who is the foundation of all reality.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Are you
in terms of the dream aspect? I mean, yeah, but I mean, think of it just like Inception.
Right,
It feels
dude,
more real every time.
I'm with you on that. Get all. He's a Jewish philosopher, and he
not.
This is sweet. I'm actually excited. I get to like show you something. But he has this paper. I think it's called like, are we God's imaginary friends or something like that? Imaginary beings, original, and making, perfect being, a perfect.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, if you talk to people who've, I mean, when we dream, we come up with imaginary people to talk to, but they take on a life of their own.
Yeah.
Some people that have feel like that, people that have like schizophrenia, for example, have that kind of condition too, where they make up people that they talk to and they take on a life of their own.
Right.
I mean, authors come up with people.
And the funny thing is a lot of that can be physically understood. We don't have like complete descriptions or a complete understanding of it, but what we understand thus far is thoroughly physical. I find that interesting.
There's a more healthy version of that. I mean, they create characters that take on a life of their own.
Yeah.
This is one of the problems George R.R. Martin has right now finishing his book series, is he can't figure out how to get the characters he has created to the finale.
Yeah.
Why? Because he doesn't think, based on their character development, how they're going to act, that they would go the direction he would like for them to go in. So he's got to think of different things he can put in their way that would influence them and make them go that way.
Yeah.
And that's what's really fascinating about writing these types of characters, is that in a lot of ways in our brains or in our minds, they take on a life of their own.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so good. Okay. I'm going to go with this direction. So I got so many ways I want to go here, but is God like pure information or not? Like, do we not go that route?
No, I don't think he's pure information. I think he's a mind, and it's just the fundamental basis of reality. It cannot reduce to anything else.
Okay. Are we sorry to keep like going over this. I just want to make sure it's clear. Like, would you say like we're made of mind? Is the stuff that we're made out of, is it like itself?
That we are like somehow part of God's consciousness. I think how the Bible calls us the bride of Christ, that we are some sort of and is your consciousness. So in some sense, they are in consciousness, and there are these different personalities operating in there. So like, but they're not you. They're not part of your distinct soul. But they, they kind of are. It's blurry. It's there is this distinction, but there's not. It's hard to say. And so you could say that it's hard to really deny that they are not, in some sense, in consciousness.
Well, do you think that they have like
Like what's kind of going on there? It's hard to really say. So I want to say yes, because in some sense they might be, but I can't fully say yes or no on that.
Yeah. I don't know why this is bugging me right now, man. This is the first time I've kind of thought about this. I talked with Josh Rasmussen a little bit about this, but we mostly focused on how we couldn't intentionally make our dream characters conscious, like if we wanted to, and how that's kind of another hard problem of consciousness is like making consciousness, if like by choice. But now I'm thinking like those dream characters, there's something.
Again, I'm just trying to find something a little more interesting than
I have
talking
it every
about
night.
dream
It's plausible.
people.
And then you can run the argument, either way. That's really crazy to think about. I don't know. I'm just sorry. I'm blowing our mind here.
The more you study your own mind and you study your own consciousness, it gets stranger and stranger, to be honest.
Yeah. Dude, I don't know, man. The physics is pretty wild too. I don't really mess with physics at all. So like when I really enjoy listening to your stuff and thinking about like the world and like, man, like electrons and wave functions are, maybe I'm not even getting this right, but they're just like probabilities, right? They're not, you can like point out a probability of where it might be. Cause I think of,
well, they're physical objects, but we can describe them with probabilistic mathematics in some sense.
a wave as like it's a whole thing. It's like this.
What?
But can you explain like what do people take waves to be in quantum wave theory?
Well, I mean, it's just
Differences in the distributions of the probabilities defining the system. Like in quantum mechanics, like it's difficult to put in a framework without going in to some mathematics that most people don't really want to listen to it. So number one, wave particle duality is kind of a misnomer. They're always waves. It's just that we can sort of quote unquote reduce the waviness, so to speak, to the extent that we can say meaningful things about whatever observable. But the wave part is this idea that the values for the observable that we want to measure can be probabilistically smeared, and that those probabilities themselves can evolve in time, and that when they do so, they do it in seemingly wave-like ways. It's hard to try to characterize in a palatable way because this stuff is not very intuitive. That's the problem. So what are the waves? Well, the waves, you almost want to say the probabilities are like flowing as they evolve. As the system evolves in time, the probabilities that define various states of the system sort of flow in wave-like ways. It's weird. But then that puts wrong ideas in people's heads about what the math says when you use those kinds of analogies. And that's what makes quantum mechanics so difficult, is that if you're not just like saying what the math says in like mathy terms, you have to use analogies, and they don't always capture correctly, or I should say, in some like sort of one-to-one or close to one-to-one identity relation, what's actually happening. They're analogies. And oftentimes that can end up misleading people into thinking that something is happening that's not happening, or something is a way that it isn't. And this is where you really start to get into the philosophy of physics and the metaphysics associated with this and the various interpretations of quantum mechanics. Why is quantum mechanics structured this way? And is there any way that we could potentially explain why it is this way?
Just the probability of where you could find something that's
That's
in
so
that
weird.
wave there.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's typically what we mean by that. Like Eliana Pesa, as a physicist, says a particle is nothing but effective field descriptions of a complicated dynamics coupling the environment and the fields. It's not really even a thing. It's just almost like a blip coming up in a different field. And
Yeah.
so and there's a probability of where you
Well,
could
yeah. So what that physicist was saying is that what particles really are just like defined results of the dynamic interaction of a field as it couples to its environment. That they're what result from quantum fields when they interact with one another in the variety of ways that they can interact. That manifests in the forms of particles that are quote unquote exchanged between the structures that are formed from these fields as they interact, which is true, and that's all physical.
you could find that blip.
Yeah, and that's like that blows my mind because isn't that taken to be like the most fundamental physical thing? Even though like right, it's not probably not right to say that it's physical, but that's like you don't.
It is. Quantum fields are physical.
Do they have anything lower than that? I guess are superstrings posited
No.
as being lower than a wave?
There are different theories that maybe there are strings. I mean, then
Yeah.
there's the competing big theory of loop quantum gravity as well. I mean, what they'll say is that at the base of quantum field theory is quantum fields.
Yeah.
But I mean, we know from that quantum fields have the same problems that particle interpretations have.
No, they don't. They use different operators. Things are defined differently. You can mathematically reconstruct the superposition of a quantum field, or reconstruct a quantum field as a superposition of a variety of like particle, partite systems. I think a Fock space again is what they're called. But that doesn't mean that the same problems translate. The mathematics is a little bit different, particularly with respect to the operators.
So I mean,
And operators are what they sound like. They're mathematical objects that operate on other mathematical objects to produce even other different mathematical objects. Like when you take the derivative of a function in calculus, you're using the derivative operator operating on a function with it to produce the rate of change of the function. So that's what an operator is in mathematics. It's a thing that operates on some mathematical structure to produce a value or a number or something like that, another function, what have you.
I mean, some physicists like Minor Kuhlman are saying, well, we can't even posit something down there because he says a quantum field instead assigns abstract mathematical entities, which represent a type of.
What is that?
He says a quantum field instead assigns abstract mathematical entities, which represent a type of measurement you could conduct.
Yeah.
So it is not at all.
On physical entities, though. Yes, there are abstract mathematical quantities, but they're associated to physical systems possessing non-zero energy, causally engaged with other non-zero energy possessing physical entities. Quantum fields are physical. Elementary particles are physical. The connections and the couplings between them are physical.
Not at all clear what a particle or even a field is, as he says.
Well, a particle is just a. Why do I keep? Okay.
And so they put out.
Okay, that's a better face. There you go, Mike. I'm sorry that I keep pausing, and he's not like he's probably never going to see this, but I'm sorry I keep pausing the video. The weirdest faces. I swear I'm not doing it purposefully. But well, a particle is just a resonant perturbation in a fundamental field, and a quantum field is just a distribution of non-zero energy at every point through space. It's the idea that you have a structure in space that is non-zero in its energy at every point in it, and that these quantities, whilst being non-zero, hover around zero in a perturbative and indeterministic way as a result of relations of uncertainty between as the field couples to itself. Oh shit, what was I going to say? I don't know, it'll come to me.
Put out this idea called ontic structural realism, that at the base of all physical reality is just structures, information, but no actual substance.
Yeah.
Well, that depends if you take to a radical structural realism or a moderate structural realism. Both would be forms of ontic structural realism, which is different than epistemic structural realism. That's a lot of big terms. I'm really, really sorry to throw them all out quickly. I'm not going to talk about what epistemic structural realism is. It's really not relevant. I'm going to talk about what Michael said. Ontic structural realism is the idea that there really is an external physical reality, and that it is constructed of, well, so there's radical structural within the ontic structural realist camp. There is radical structural realism. People like, I think his name is, I know his last name is Ladyman. Is it James Ladyman? I want to say somebody with the last name Ross developed something, I believe, that's generally known as radical structural realism. It's been a little bit since I've read on this, so I'm not fully clear on the authors. There are two postulates that could be said to classify at least a radical structural realist camp. Let's see if I can remember them. Okay, I'm gonna have to look up this paper that defines it. Let's see if I can find this paper. Oh, I think I can. I think I've got it saved. I believe I have it saved. Maybe not. I thought I did. It might take a few minutes because I am gonna find this because I want to I really want to stress this point. Here we go. I think this might be it. No, that's not a PDF, so that can't be it. Here, let me try a different. Ah, yes, here we go. Here it is. So this is a paper called, I'm not going to share it just because I don't really need to, but it's a paper called Moderate Structural Realism About Space-Time. It's by Michael Esfeld and Vincent Lamb. And this is where they develop more of a moderate structural realism that sort of contrasts with the radical structural realism, but that both exist in the ontic structural realist camp. And they define, so yeah, radical structural realism would be defined by two postulates. Number one, that relations require relata, that is, objects that stand in the relations, and that these objects necessarily have intrinsic properties over and above the relations that they bear to one another. So that there are things that stand in relations, and that those things that stand in the relations have properties that they would hold independent of the relations that they stand in. But a moderate structural realist would affirm the first postulate, that relations require relata, or objects that stand in the relations, but they would deny the second one. It is not the case that these objects necessarily have intrinsic properties over and above the relations that they bear to one another. And so I am a moderate structural realist. And so I think that with respect to what IP was saying, I don't even fully remember it, that it's going to depend on what type of structural realist or ontic structural realist that you are. And it wasn't Ross, it was French. I can't remember his first name, French and Ladyman, who developed sort of the radical structural realism. And then it's the Vincent Lamb and Michael Esfeld that developed moderate structural realism.
Yeah, man. I remember. So that kind of, I only know about structure type stuff because of studying like hylomorphism, and some of the hylomorphists go so deep on structures, and they're like, yeah, you're just structure. And it's like, what are we even talking about at this point? Like, it's so deep and so crazy. Like, well, what's a structure? And you get to a certain point and something has to be fundamental. So you're like, it's fundamental. Okay.
You could say that a structure is just a relation held between two or more relata.
So I can't explain it anymore. Like, all right, man, that's crazy. But all right. Man, that's crazy. When it comes to again, dude, sorry for being sporadic here, but I'm just taking them as they're coming in here. When it comes to individuating different people, like I'm different than you, but we're all made of mind, and it's probably the same mind. It's probably God's mind. Yeah, how do we how is it that I have a different conscious experience than you? I mean, I guess you could just go with the dream characters again.
Oh Lord, I'm tired of hearing about dream characters. I'm sorry. I'm so
They're
sorry.
all conscious, But then
What?
you run into this problem of, the combination problem of like,
Oh, okay.
I have a singular unified phenomenal consciousness. So how is it that I have that when I'm made up of all these trillions of conscious little things? Then there's the priority monist view,
for
which just says like the
panpsychism.
universe is conscious.
That was that. Oh shit! I'm sorry, Parker. Oh fuck, that's hilarious. Oh. Anyway, the combination problem. I think that's a sort of an objection to panpsychism. That look, if there are like things that are conscious, even if they're not like nearly as conscious as us, but they possess some sort of I'm gonna have to make sure I don't look at the screen. But they possess some sort of consciousness, even some level of it, even if it's not at our level. How does that stack to give rise to our seemingly unified conscious experience? How would we break that down? If electrons and like quarks are individually have some level of consciousness, does that stack then into like protons and atoms and then stack into like molecule? Like, how does that work? How does this combine into a unified conscious experience? And that's sort of the combination problem for panpsychism, if I'm remembering correctly.
And we are different like pieces of the universe, but with different properties, and so we have different like perspectives. But ultimately, we all.
I just gotta say, I am on a roll today with pausing these videos on just the worst possible faces. I swear to fucking God, I'm not doing it purposefully.
We are all participating in the same like consciousness. Insofar as I've represented it well, like, what do you make of that? Is that similar to the idealism that you put forward?
I think so.
Okay.
I need to study a little bit more to know for sure, though.
Could make sense of that, of our
Could
dreaming.
be.
Yeah, right. What do you think about like
I mean,
like us and God's consciousness? Like, hey, kind of. You guys are kind of right. You guys are kind of right, but you're both wrong. Here's the middle way, and it's better. I'm wondering if, and I don't know if I've heard you say this or not, but I'm wondering if idealism, if you think that idealism can help us understand divine intervention a little bit more, because maybe on like a I don't even know, maybe on like a realist account, or on a view where God and the world are completely separate. On a non-idealistic view, you have like God interjecting or intervening into what seems like a closed system, and you have to make arguments about causal closure and stuff. Is it any easier on idealism, or do we inherit the same kind of problem? Or does that?
Just for the audience sake, causal closure is this idea in metaphysics that reality is causally closed, that there isn't anything outside of physical reality that causally interacts with it or with anything inside of it. Physical reality is causally closed.
You inherit the same kind of problems,
or that to the best of our ability to measure reality, it by all rights appears to be causally closed, and that this should warrant good reason for thinking that things like miracles and divine intervention probably don't occur, and any sort of supernatural occurrences that we see in reality are probably some form of natural occurrence, whether some unexplained natural phenomena that we're just is we just don't know how to explain because it's fleeting. It's something that's maybe you don't experience very often, or it could be some sort of psychological factor. So that's where this notion of causal closure comes from.
I don't think it does, because everything is mind, and God can just sort of like, if he wants, add a cheat code into the mental simulation and change something easily.
Yeah.
And this is an argument that I've often made. I don't know how to formalize it, and I don't know if I even can, but I've often said that God couldn't ever violate the laws of physics, but that God would know that. He would create reality such that it operates by its laws. What he could do is create laws that allow for whatever it is that he wants, but he can't create the laws and then completely violate the laws, because then they're just not laws anymore. It would just, I don't know what they would be. So at best, God would need sort of cheat codes that are defined within the laws, the laws of that reality, but that do not violate them, sort of like in a video game where cheat codes don't violate the rules of the game, they're built into them. And if you know how to use them, you can get interesting things to happen, but they're not violations. I would argue God would need something like that.
Yeah.
But then again, what I would say is that what that's going to mean is just we're never going to be able to determine that is a divine event, because it's going to look from our perspective as something occurring within the framework of the laws of physics, even if it's something that's seemingly out of the ordinary prima facie. And so in virtue of that seems to sort of make superfluous the notion that it would be something divine. What reason would we have for thinking that?
No, that's good. Does okay, so everything is like okay, the fundamental things are mind, but the physical things, you talk a lot about like emergence, like they've emerged out. Are physical things, are they, just because they're made of mind doesn't mean they're mind, I guess, necessarily. Do you make a distinction, like, are physical things built on mind, or are they fundamentally, mind themselves? What do you make of that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I say physical things are information that is
Yeah.
contingent upon mind. So, mind can imagine something, and I could, close my eyes and imagine a whole world right now. And that information, of course, is contingent upon mind in a sense, but it is still these information constructs that we sort of build or put together. And so I would just say matter is just information constructs built upon mind. I mean, in a sense, it reduces to the substance of mind, but it's still more than that.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. That's really helpful. Information constructs built on mind. Okay, do you think so? I think your arguments usually start with like, here's what we have in front of us. Here's physics, and here's some good data to work with and make arguments with. And so it looks like we are living God's mind. But I don't think that you make arguments that say like God couldn't create an external world. Do you think that God could make a external world?
Yeah, I mean, I think he could. I just don't think that he needs to, and so he doesn't. I mean, what would be the point of that? Creating a world that's not contingent on him.
Yeah, I was gonna say, when I first heard that question, I was gonna say I think that Michael's answer would be that God could, but it wouldn't be prudent. It wouldn't be the most rational decision for God to make with respect to how he makes a world. And that seems like kind of how IP answered that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, Sam Liebens, who I mentioned earlier, and Tyron Goldschmidt, they have this argument that like God's perfect, and so he couldn't create anything that's less than perfect, but the idea of a perfect world is incoherent, so God can't create outside of himself. So
yeah, that's something you might hear from apologists, that, well, I don't think God could create the best of all possible worlds because I don't think there's such a thing. I think that's incoherent. I don't think it's incoherent. The best of all possible worlds is a world in which anything and everything that occurs in that world is what ought to occur, all things considered. There is no event whatsoever that occurs in that world that oughtn't occur, all things considered. That's the best of all possible worlds. That's how I would define it. And it seems to me that God would create that. Like the whole argument that if God is defined as a perfect being, then God cannot create anything less than a perfect world is a little bit complex. I'm not going to get into it here because it's not the topic of this stream, but I think it is a meaningful argument, and it relates to the argument from evil, the logical argument from evil. I mean, even the evidential argument from evil, because in a sense, the evidential argument from evil does sort of at least play off of the logical argument from evil, but there is a distinction between them.
So he can only create inside his mind. And how about, so maybe I just kind of broached it a little bit, but how about the problem of like reconciling, free choices if we're in like a dream world? It seems like your focus is not necessarily on the story as it plays out, but more about like the furniture of the story, like all the stuff on the stage, and then maybe the actors can freely act how they want. Does that?
I definitely apologize for this, guys, but it's been going for a little over 3 hours. I do have to use the restroom. I'm going to shut my camera off, but I am going to let this keep playing so that you're not just sitting here in silence. But I do need to use the restroom, so I will be right back.
Does that sound right? Or what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that God creates like actual little characters, like in a story world, and they take on a life of their own. They sort of come into existence, and they're not entirely determined by God's will or His first person perspective, but that you could still say they are emergent from Him, sort of like dream characters, and that we create are emergent from us, but we don't entirely control them when we're in our dreams.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I like that. That's fascinating. Um, okay. So going back to this is all over. Going back to like quantum mind type stuff. I'm not as familiar with like your quantum mind videos, but um, do you go in for like Penrose's microtubule type stuff? His view.
So I talk a little bit about the microtubules, and I think there's something there, but I mean, they sort of try to say that consciousness is quantum collapse happening in
Yeah.
these microtubules. So a collapse moment, when something collapses, it creates a moment of consciousness. So our brains are constantly creating moments of consciousness from different quantum collapse experiences happening in our microtubules. I don't think that's what's happening.
Okay.
I agree more with Henry Stapp that consciousness causes collapse, not that consciousness is collapse.
Yeah.
So there's a difference there. I think you still have the measurement problem if you're going to take that view.
Okay.
So I tend to say that it's just sort of like the manifestation of a conscious agent. This is what the brain basically is. And the collapse in the microtubules would be just a manifestation of thoughts or the conscious agent making a choice.
Yeah.
So that's all that it is. And so that's the difference. That's what Penrose and Hameroff try to do, is they want to try to go so far to the extreme that they're saying that the brain is creating consciousness by generating these different collapses constantly happening.
And then I mean, would you call that a reductionist view? Because it's like
The good old orchestrated objective reduction. Orchestrated objection. Orchestrated objective reduction. That's the model. Yeah. Physicists and neuroscientists and neurophilosophers broadly have largely rejected that model.
making consciousness, depend on the brain. Yeah. And what you've argued is
Yeah,
that's the wrong way.
it's physicalism.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's physicalism in some ways, and so I reject that outright.
Yeah. No, that's good. So, so God has set up like, psychophysical laws that, so
Why are psychophysical laws set by God? What's the argument for that, Parker? Why do I do this?
certain things happen, like there's still an external world to us, though it is in God's mind. And we have souls, like, man, when sperm meets egg, are there two?
Oh,
Yeah, right. Can you tell us how babies happen? When sperm meets egg, is it like their soul underneath the physical sperm, and the physical sperm is like an
okay. I don't really
For me,
care about what all that is.
This is just the manifestation
okay.
of the mental itself. So it's not so much physical, it's giving rise to a mental thing. It's that this is just what it's the same with us. We are a manifestation of a conscious agent. This is the physical body. And likewise, that is just the information of two people coming together to begin a new soul. And so it just sort of begins the process again.
At what point does the soul become a part of the body? That's the question I like to ask. At what point does the soul become a part of the body? And how did you determine that it is this moment? And if it's not a singular moment, then over what period of time does the soul become part of the body? How does this occur? How did you determine that it occurs that way? Stuff like that. Just start asking those kinds of questions. And what you realize, and see, this is the thing about like souls and immaterial aspects to our consciousness and mind being fundamental, is to just start asking people what they mean by this. And you'll realize that when you put this stuff under a more strict, analysis, there's just not much substance there with respect to explaining anything in any meaningful context. And certainly not to the degree that physicalism or just methodological naturalism broadly seems to have. And I just think that that's a point against these sort of non-physicalist, idealist, or otherwise supernaturalist perspectives about a variety of different things.
I don't think
Okay.
the physical really. I mean, you also have to take in mind the fact that I don't deny that there's this total distinction between the physical and the mental. I mean,
Sure.
physical things affect us all the time.
Yeah.
You give me drugs, it's going to affect the way I'm going to act and behave. So there's this constant interaction going on because I don't think there's any sort of distinction there. The
Yeah.
physical is just the manifestation of the mental.
Yeah.
So the same would apply with the beginning of a new soul.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense in the case of like a person, but like a pre-person, like a sperm and an egg before they're joined. To me, it would seem like they would have to have like half soul, half then.
Okay. Okay. Let's move past this. Something more interesting.
Souls that are being built from that.
Dude, that's helpful. That's a really helpful clarification. Okay. How about when, so we're Christians, how about when a Christian is indwelt by the Holy Spirit? What do you,
I don't care.
Is that-
Sorry, I genuinely, I don't care.
So I can consciously decide to pick up my glass and consciously decide to put it down. But a lot of stuff we do is not through conscious deliberation. It's through what I would call running on autopilot. Like when we drive, we're
Right.
often just turning the wheel or pushing the pedal without thinking about it. We don't have to consciously think to do these things.
Mhm.
So Daniel Dennett talks about this, about how in some sense we create another version of ourselves that just sort of can do certain things on its own. So we have, in my view, two senses of agency in our minds. We have a broad and a narrow sense. The narrow sense is this little man in the machine, as you would so to say.
I thought he was going to say direct and indirect agency because I've heard that before too. We have a direct agency and then we have the indirect agency.
Who can decide between different desires, different dispositions, different goals, and make a choice. But he's still deciding between things or aspects that are part of his whole mind or his whole soul, so to speak. And then there's that broad sense of agency, which includes all of that stuff. So if you got in a car crash, you couldn't say, officer, it wasn't my fault. I was daydreaming. It was my soul that did it. That wouldn't fly.
Yeah.
You clearly created that soul, that broad sense of agency that got into the car crash. So my view of the Trinity is just this take our understanding of agency. And they talk to each other. They coexist.
I don't really care
better
about the
way to
Trinity
explain it.
either.
Because mental things can be explained as being three in one. When they're trying to study the Trinity.
Yeah. All right. Last one. Is there something that it's like to be God that is distinct from what it's like to be the Father or from this? Man, if I can point anyone in your direction, I'd love to.
Okay, I think that wraps that
I mean,
up.
I'll be
So that also wraps up a stream. Yeah, it went about as long as I thought, a little over 3 hours. So I hope that everyone who's tuned in or who's watching the playback and has made it this far, I hope you've enjoyed the journey that we've taken, examining some claims made by some apologists in the recent weeks that have occurred. They're still getting a lot of things wrong. There's a lot that's being misunderstood. There's other videos that I have responding to claims made by apologists showing how they also get a lot of other things wrong with respect to physics. It baffles me that apologists continue to do this. It seems obvious that they don't actually sit down and talk to the physicists about these things. They don't talk to the philosophers of physics about these things. Or if they do, they go to a very, very select, probably niche group of them that already holds to ideas that they're sort of a little bit more dispositioned to disposed rather to believe or to accept. I just want apologists to have a meaningful understanding of this. You don't need to say some of the things that have been said in this stream, not by me, in order to believe in God or to argue for his existence. And it would just, I think, help if you actually excuse me. Whoa. I think it would help if a lot of these apologists actually argue from what physics is saying rather than from what I would quite frankly call rather convoluted interpretations of what the physics is saying. And with that, remember, as always, my friends, through reason, we progress. Y'all take it easy, and I'll see you in the next one.